Step lively, Mr. Darcy. A light-hearted Darcy and Elizabeth Christmastime romance by Laura Hile. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. 1. According to Folly. My life is a perfect misery of shattered dreams. With a heavy sigh, Mrs. Bennet lifted her teacup from its saucer. Yes, shattered, my dear sister. There is no other word for it. She took a sip of tea before adding, No one knows what I suffer. Mrs. Phillips gave Mrs. Bennet's arm an affectionate pat. My dear, you have all my sympathy. How kind you are, how caring, and yet how can you understand the depth of my worry? For you have never had daughters, or sons, said Mrs. Phillips quietly. Oh, if only we had had a son! Mrs. Bennet hunted up a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. He would have joined with Mr. Bennet in ending the iniquitous entail, and I would not be as I am now, in a state of continual anxiety. My poor nerves. Your husband enjoys robust health. But for how long? At any moment an illness could send him to the grave, and then where would we be? Mr. Collins will turn us out of the house before Mr. Bennet is cold. Perhaps it is best to count your blessings, said Mrs. Phillips. Your girls are the prettiest in Meryton. That is something. Yes, but to what end? Time and again I have told myself that it cannot be for nothing. But dear Mr. Bingley has gone away, perhaps forever. Now what is my beautiful Jane to do? His sister's letter to Jane was cruel. Did I tell you of it? Mrs. Bennet did not wait for a reply, but plunged ahead. Mr. Bingley is to give up Netherfield Park and never return. Miss Bingley expects that he will propose to Mr. Darcy's sister. Shocking. Mrs. Phillips helped herself to another sandwich. As for Mary, there is no one remotely interested in courting her. Who would? If only she would take the trouble to be agreeable. Whereas Catherine and Lydia, Mrs. Bennet interrupted, while the officers of the militia are charming and attentive, none of them have approached Mr. Bennet for permission to propose. My girls simply must marry, and marry well. Mrs. Phillips offered the plate of sandwiches, but Mrs. Bennet waved it away. I cannot think of food at a time like this. But you must keep up your strength. Mrs. Bennet eyed the plate and relented. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, she said, around a bite, and indeed I still do in my heart. I tell you this, if a smart young colonel with 5,000 or 6,000 a year should want one of my girls, I shall not say nay to him. Is this not the amount of Mr. Bingley's income? Indeed, yes, more's the pity. Poor Jane. She would have been set for life. Mrs. Bennet finished the first sandwich and helped herself to a second. I thought Colonel Forster looked very becoming in his regimentals the other night. But there is a rumour that he is on the brink of becoming engaged. He could have had our Kitty. I doubt his income is as generous as 5,000 or 6,000 a year. Speaking of generous incomes, Mr. Darcy has also gone away. As if anyone would want him, a proud, disagreeable man. I hope he never comes here again. Did I tell you how he insulted my Lizzie? Shocking. Everyone says so. He refused to dance with her. He told Mr. Bingley that she was not handsome enough to tempt him. Horrible man. Our Lizzie is beautiful. I wash my hands of him. It was an overheard remark, however. He did not say so to her directly. He might as well. Poor Lizzie. Mrs. Phillips lifted the teapot. May I refill your cup? Mrs. Bennet lowered her voice. I tell you this, sister, with the way I am feeling, I wish it were something stronger than tea. I'll gladly fetch the ratafia, dear, but perhaps one of these delightful biscuits will do as well. Mrs. Phillips offered the plate. Your cook has a fine light hand. The best in all Hertfordshire. Not that it makes any difference now that Mr. Bingley is not here to share our table. And I have more bad news. Will you pass me my letters? Mrs. Bennet indicated a stack on a nearby table. Her sister complied. This one is from our sister, dear Mrs. Gardiner. Apparently the children are ill. She and our brother will not come for Christmas, as they do not wish to expose Mr. Bennet to any risk of infection. Is this not considerate? Very kind. I shall miss seeing them. 2 more came today, and I cannot tell you which letter is worse. How irksome that Mr. Bennet must pay to receive such claptrap! I have a much better use for the money. Mrs. Bennet hunted out the first offending document and unfolded it. Mrs. Bannerman has written another of her rambling letters. This is hardly a surprise, given her fondness for self-applauding nonsense. Apparently her eldest son has distinguished himself at Guildcrest, which, if you ask me, is a second-rate school. It is not as if any of the Bannerman sons will ever be gentlemen. One must excuse a mother's natural pride. Mrs. Bennet selected another letter. For that we have our dear cousin Mrs. Thorpe. Her letters are rather tiresome. Poor dear, she considers Bath to be a fashionable resort. Who is she? Quite a distant relation, one of Great-aunt Harvey's cousins. You will recall that she often crowed about what a fine match Bella had made. It certainly was, for her. Mr. Thorpe was in a very prosperous line of business. Was. Has he given up his profession? He is dead, said Mrs. Bennet. Dear me, has Mrs. Thorpe any children? A son at Oxford. There's one in the eye for Mrs. Bannerman. A cut above her precious gilt crest. The eldest, Isabella, is said to be quite beautiful. I believe there are 2 more girls. If Bella Barker is the cousin you mean, she was very pretty. Her daughters must be lovely. I dare say they cannot hold a candle to any of my girls. Mrs. Phillips gave Mrs. Bennet's arm another pat. They do you credit, my dear. Our cousin is as much of a flatterer as ever. She is subtle, but she cannot pull the wool over my eyes. As always, she is angling for an invitation to Longbourn. One can scarcely blame her. You did make a splendid match in marrying Mr. Bennet. It is no wonder that Mrs. Thorpe wishes to enjoy your society. Yes, but to what purpose? Mrs. Bennet set the letters aside. I had such hopes, especially for our sweet Jane. She doted on Charles Bingley, I know she did, and he went away and forgot her so easily. And then there is Lizzie. Is she ill? Of course not. Lizzie is like her father. She is never ill, but she ought to have accepted Mr. Collins's proposal. All our problems would have been solved, and now, no thanks to her, I must guard Mr. Bennet's health with redoubled vigilance. A wise undertaking. That Charlotte Lucas did not waste a minute, but snatched up Mr. Collins at once. I cannot bear to think of her as mistress of this house. Mrs. Phillips refilled her teacup. Perhaps Mr. Collins will die before he inherits. A happy thought. Nevertheless, our Lizzie is simply too particular. It would serve her right to be forced to marry someone. Not forced, dear. Elizabeth is not loose in her morals. Obliged, then, compelled by duty, for when the years of danger arrive, and they do for each of us, she shall sing a different tune. It is a pity that there are so few eligible gentlemen within our circle. Richard Lucas is away at school, as Elizabeth considered him. As if the Lucases have as much as 1,000 a year. Even if Lizzie did like him, which I dare say she does not, she would never have him. I give Lizzie some credit. The entire family is as plain as can be. His father is only a knight. The title is not passed down. Richard Lucas is to manage his uncle's business affairs one day, as if being a steward were a thing to crow about. Mrs. Bennet gave another sigh. She ought to have married Mr. Collins. Did Elizabeth object to his occupation? Did she not like to be a clergyman's wife? The church is a vocation that many gentlemen are willing to embrace. Even Mrs. Thorpe's son is hopeful of obtaining a parish. There was a short silence. Mrs. Bennet's chin came up. "My dear sister," she said in an altered voice, "you have given me an idea. Indeed you have. There, I knew you would rally. Mrs. Bennet reached for a biscuit. "I am in need of sustenance to support me. It is an excellent idea. Yes, quite perfect. It is in keeping with the season, too. Peace on earth and goodwill to men." Mrs. Phillips said nothing until her sister finished the biscuit. "And," she inquired pleasantly, "the gardeners are unable to come for Christmas, so our guest-rooms will be empty," said Mrs. Bennet slowly. "Instead, I shall invite Mrs. Thorpe and her son to join us." "What about her daughters?" "I needn't invite them, but our cousin shall not mind, especially once she learns the reason for the visit." "What reason would that be?" "Why, to entice her son to fall in love with our Lizzie. Mr. Collins lost his heart to her, sure enough, within a very short space of time. I dare say Mr. Thorpe will do the same." "Becoming engaged during the Christmas holidays," said Mrs. Phillips. "It is quite an idea, romantic even." "And a very good thing for the Thorpes, for it is quite a step up for their precious son, as well as a relief to me. I shall have Lizzie off my hands." "There is only the one son," said Mrs. Phillips. "I take it he shall inherit the bulk of his father's fortune?" "Precisely." Mrs. Bennet dusted crumbs from her fingers and rose to her feet. "Pray excuse me, dear. I must send the invitation as soon as may be. What a very good thing it was that Mrs. Thorpe wrote that tiresome letter." 2. Turning Point. It was a cold, gloomy, biting night. Outside Darcy's London house, dismal fingers of fog shrouded passers-by and muted the rattling of carriages. The warmth and light of Darcy's library was especially inviting. He poured out a cup of coffee and passed it to his guest. "I must say this is first-rate," said Charles Bingley. "So much better than lounging about in Hurst's drawing-room, or being dragged to the theatre, or," he added, "having to listen to Louisa and Caroline jaw on about the latest gossip, as if they knew any of the fashionable persons involved." Charles paused to add cream and sugar. "Whenever I do purchase an estate, you must remind me of the pleasures of a snug library. It needn't be only for reading." He took a swallow of coffee and sighed with contentment. "Then again," he added, "your sister does not depend on you so entirely." "She does, but not in the same way." In truth, it was all Darcy could do to draw Georgiana out and coax her to talk. He himself was shy. Georgiana was even more so. At present the poor girl was suffering from a bad cold. This evening she had chosen to remain upstairs with Mrs. Annesley, rather than join them for dinner. Charles set his cup aside. "I have taken a place in the country, but is Caroline satisfied? No." How was Darcy supposed to respond to this? Fortunately, Charles went on talking. "For the better part of a year she has whined and coaxed and scolded me into hiring an estate, and now that I have, Netherfield is not good enough for her, all because it is not as grand as Pemberley." Pemberley was Darcy's ancestral residence in Derbyshire. "I do not see how it could be," he said mildly. "In a little more than a fortnight it will be Christmas. Why am I kicking my heels in London?" "Presumably because there is more here to interest Miss Bingley." "Or it is because she dislikes the society of country people. What nonsense! I've never met so many agreeable people in all my life." By this Charles meant the beautiful Jane Bennet. Darcy concealed a sigh. He'd seen no evidence of love in Jane. She was gentle and serene, but nothing more. Her mother, on the other hand, supplied the eagerness Jane lacked. The woman was ill-bred enough to boast to her friends that Jane's engagement to Charles was imminent. Charles would do well to forget Jane, and he was on his way to doing so, or so Darcy thought. The real danger was her sister, Elizabeth. Here was a young woman who was not only lovely, but intelligent and sincerely intriguing. Nor did she attempt to captivate him. In fact, it was quite the reverse. Wasn't this a refreshing change? In short, Elizabeth was bewitchingly lovely, unspoiled by the sophisticated society that Charles's sister craved. Darcy was not unmoved. Indeed, he was attracted to Elizabeth more than he liked, much more. Charles heaved out of his chair and began to pace about. "What does Caroline think it's going to be like once she lands a husband?" He halted alongside Darcy's chair. "Unless he's a fashionable gent like Hurst, she'll be spending months in the country. Once she sets up a nursery, it could be years." Darcy was surprised into a laugh. "Her precious season won't be in full swing for some time, and even then she'll be unhappy, as she shan't be invited to the most fashionable parties. What rot!" Cheerful diffidence was one of the things Darcy liked most about Charles Bingley. "It is, rather," he agreed. "Swaggering about, doing the polite to people I care nothing for, and who could not care less if I were alive or dead. Caroline's ambition has become an obsession. Why seek to impress gents who turn up their noses at her?" "I expect you know the answer to that," said Darcy quietly. Charles's wealth had come through trade. The only gentlemen willing to consider wedding Caroline Bingley would be those with financial need. "And we do have friends in Meryton, more so than here. Not that Caroline considers them to be worth our time. And here's another thing. What is so wrong with Miss Bennet, I'd like to know? Caroline and Louisa were as sweet as could be, but now that we are here, nothing about Jane is good enough." Charles's use of Miss Bennet's Christian name was telling. "I jolly well do not need a mother," he added. "I agree. Furthermore, what say has Caroline in my choice of a property?" "Very little, I imagine." "She's chomping at the bit to marry," said Charles, "although she's devilish particular." "We have spoken before about the challenges she shall face." "Caroline is not looking for love or anything like that. But I am." Charles took another turn about the library, and then added, "See here, a fellow wants a wife who is fond of him, not a cold, ceremonious creature who is beautifully dressed and faultlessly behaved, and," he added, "who sees wealth and social position as the keys to her happiness." Darcy smiled ruefully. Here were the very reasons he was yet unmarried. Charles returned to the chair by the fire and cast himself into it. "Everyone who is anyone has an estate in the country. That's where the gentry spend Christmas." Here was a surprise. "My dear Charles, are you thinking of returning to Netherfield?" "I am. Naturally, Caroline will make a fuss." "Then let her." Now why had Darcy said this? It wasn't as if he meant to encourage his friend. Charles struck the arm of his chair. "That's right," he cried. "If she's so keen on London, she can jolly well stay with the Hursts. She's precious fond of Grosvenor Square. It is just the place for her. She can shop until her quarterly allowance runs out. I must say, although her clothes cost the earth, they look only half as nice as Miss Bennet's do." "Miss Bennet and her sister," said Darcy quietly, "have charm." "Right again. Moreover, Jane and Elizabeth Bennet do not care what others think. You shan't catch them gazing into the pier-glass every time they pass by." So Charles had noticed this about his sister. "They are a gentleman's daughters, and as such they have nothing to prove. You would do well, however, to be certain that Jane Bennet returns your affection." "Another reason to spend Christmas at Netherfield Park." Charles hesitated, with his face tilted to one side. He put Darcy in mind of a hopeful spaniel. "Come with me." "I'm sorry, my friend. Not while Georgiana is unwell." "She has a cold, not the plague. You yourself said that her nose merely runs, and she coughs only occasionally. Ask her if she minds. The distance is not great. You can drive back to London in less than a day, or you could bring her with you." "Not on your life. Wickham is in Meryton, and—" Darcy broke off speaking. He had never told Charles of Wickham's failed scheme to elope with Georgiana, nor did he intend to. "It is unwise to jeopardize her health," he said. Charles warmed to his theme. "We'll put up sprigs of holly and mistletoe, and we'll order the sort of dinners we like, without having to consult my sisters." Darcy was betrayed into a smile. Mistletoe begs for female guests. We shan't have those unless, I say, why stand upon ceremony? We'll invite entire families, such as the Lucases and the Bennets. We, said Darcy. What else have you to do here? He paused, smiling. By this time, that tiresome cousin of the Bennets will have gone away. We needn't bother with him. Darcy knew precisely whom Charles meant, Mr. Collins, his aunt's pretentious rector. He sees himself as necessary to Lady Catherine's happiness, so in Kent he will remain. Does she entertain for Christmas? I cannot say, never having been a guest at Rosings during this season. Is she keen to hang mistletoe? Good gad, here was an unnerving thought. Mistletoe and Aunt Catherine. Darcy could see it now. She was determined to marry him to her daughter Anne, even though neither of them wished it. I shouldn't mind mistletoe, Charles went on, should a certain young lady be standing beneath it. Darcy's lips twisted into a smile. Truth to tell, he had no objection to the presence of Elizabeth Bennet. Great heaven, what was wrong with him? Why must he be continually thinking of her? Beauty and charm were entirely untrustworthy. Said Charles. Do you suppose the residents of Meryton hold a Christmas assembly? I should not be surprised if they do. That settles it. Does Saturday morning suit you? For what? For our departure for Netherfield. Come along, old fellow. It would not hurt you to stay for a se'nnight. 1 week could very easily turn into 2. When you return for Christmas, continued Charles, I dare say Georgiana will be completely well. Then you will be able to travel to Pemberley for Epiphany. Darcy studied his friend's eager face. A week could allow Charles's infatuation for Jane Bennet to run its course. As for his own fascination with Elizabeth, it would be well to lay that to rest. Oh, very well, he said suddenly. Saturday morning it is. Excellent. Charles took hold of Darcy's hand and shook it vigorously. Good decision. Was it? Darcy had his doubts. Ah, well, for better or worse, he was committed. But only for a week. 1 week, Charles, Darcy repeated. What could go wrong? 3. Kissing Cousins. Mrs. Bennet stared at the newly arrived letter. "Oh, dear," she cried. "Oh, dear, 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 what am I to do?" Elizabeth looked up from her sewing. "Is something wrong, mamma?" "Good gracious! They could be here as soon as tomorrow, or perhaps even today." "Who shall?" "Mrs. Thorpe and her son. How can this have happened? I distinctly said the week before Christmas, not the fortnight before. What is more, they intend to stay through Epiphany. Bella was always the stupidest girl. I dare say she did not read past my invitation before she dashed off this reply." "Who are they?" said Elizabeth. "I do not recall anyone by the name of Thorpe." Mrs. Bennet sighed heavily. "She is a distant cousin of mine who married a man of large fortune. Mr. Thorpe was a lawyer, the same as my father. His success came through trade." "Like Mr. Bingley's father," said Kitty. "Not as wealthy as that, but according to my cousin, he made some very astute investments. She and her daughters live in Putney." Kitty wrinkled her nose. "Where?" "I believe it is near London," said Elizabeth. "Why are they coming for Christmas?" "Because I invited them, but for next week, not today." Mrs. Bennet gave an anxious look to the windows. "Ring for Hile, Lizzie. I must have their bedchambers readied. Gracious, as if I did not have enough to do." "Shall we bring them to the assembly?" said Kitty. "We can scarcely avoid it. I do hope Mr. Thorpe thought to bring his evening clothes. Having an additional gentleman will be no bad thing, if they arrive today, which I sincerely hope they do not." Mrs. Bennet's gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "He is an Oxford man, and, according to his mother, he is quite the scholar. I dare say you'll like him, Lizzie." Again she paused. "He is unmarried." Elizabeth could not mistake the glint in her mother's eyes. She exchanged a look with Jane. Lydia burst into the drawing-room. "Jane, have you finished mending the hem of my dancing frock?" "Of course she has not," cried Mrs. Bennet. You gave it her only an hour ago. If you go tearing about heedless of your hem, you can expect such disasters to happen." "I am almost finished," said Jane quietly. Lydia cast herself onto one of the sofas. "An assembly will be famous good fun. We haven't had anything like it, why, since Mr. Bingley's ball." "Mr. Bingley," cried Mrs. Bennet, "pray do not remind me. Such a disappointment he was, never to return to Netherfield, after quite breaking our Jane's heart." "I am not heartbroken, mamma," said Jane. "And his friend, that Mr. Darcy, with such a snub for Lizzie. I hate the very sight of him." Elizabeth was betrayed into a smile. "There was no harm done, mamma, aside from the mortification of my pride." "You are a great deal more than tolerable. If I never see him again, it will be too soon." "Especially with all that poor Mr. Wickham has told us," said Kitty. "Mr. Darcy is not an honourable man." Elizabeth concealed a sigh. The list of Mr. Darcy's offences was long, and when she had asked for an explanation, Mr. Darcy remained silent. "He is rather good-looking," admitted Lydia. "I dare say he would be even more handsome in regimentals, like dear Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham." The conversation devolved into a discussion of the officers. "And if it is true that Colonel Forster is thinking of becoming engaged," added Lydia gaily, "why, we must make him change his mind." Shortly before noon, the sound of hoofbeats on the carriage drive brought Lydia to the windows. "A gig!" she cried, "with a gentleman and a lady. I must say he's a daring driver. How fast he's taking the bend!" Elizabeth and her mother came to join her. No sooner had the gig come to a halt, but the man jumped down, leaving the woman to wait. She wore an attractive green redingote. A fashionable hat becomingly framed her face. From beneath it peeped angelic golden curls. "Good gracious," grumbled Mrs. Bennet, "Mrs. Thorpe is remarkably well preserved for her age." Lydia burst into giggling. "She cannot be older than Jane, mamma, not with a figure like that. I wonder who she is." Mrs. Bennet pursed up her lips. A post-chaise drawn by 4 horses now turned into the carriage drive. To its boot were strapped several trunks. "What now?" wailed Mrs. Bennet. "It appears that Mr. Thorpe has brought his evening clothes after all," said Elizabeth. In the meantime the man was giving orders about the horses. He was a stout fellow of middling height, with a plain face and ungraceful form. His driving coat was adorned with large buttons, and numerous shoulder capes, which proclaimed him to be a horseman of some skill. "He's what they call an out-and-outer, isn't he?" breathed Lydia. "So it would seem," said Elizabeth. This Mr. Thorpe was far from the scholar she expected to see. Was that a nosegay in his buttonhole? He assisted the young woman to descend from the gig, and then went striding to meet the chaise. The door came open, and he let down the steps. 1, 2, 3? Mrs. Bennet counted the women as they descended. "What in the world? Has Mrs. Thorpe brought her daughters as well?" "So an additional gentleman is not such a boon?" Elizabeth remarked. "But I haven't room for them, not comfortably. Lizzie, you must write to Mrs. Phillips this instant. Mrs. Thorpe and her eldest daughter may share a room here, but my sister must take the other 2. "It would be easier if she hosted Mr. Thorpe," Elizabeth pointed out. "Certainly not. I have not gone to all this trouble to have him elsewhere." "They may have our room here, mamma," said Kitty. "Lydia and I would love to stay with Aunt Phillips. Imagine being in town close to all our friends." By this Kitty meant the officers. Elizabeth could well imagine the trouble that might come. One of the women was noticeably older. She took hold of the young man's arm. "Aha!" cried Mrs. Bennet. "That must be Mrs. Thorpe. She is not so well preserved after all." Presently the drawing-room door opened. With a rolling gait, Mr. Thorpe brought his mother in. His sisters followed. "Hullo, hullo!" he called, before Hile could announce him. "A bang-up estate you have here, ma'am. Ours is nothing to it." He took out his watch and turned to his sister. "How long do you think we've been running it from Hartmead, Belle?" "Really, John, I have no idea. Where are your manners?" Miss Thorpe gave a smiling curtsy to Mrs. Bennet. How do you do?" Mr. Thorpe gave a start, and bestowed a whole scrape and half a short bow. This sent his fobs and seals to swinging. "How do, cousins?" he said gaily. Once the introductions were performed, Mrs. Bennet begged everyone to be seated. "We'll have refreshments brought in presently. I dare say you are worn from travel." "Not at all," said Mrs. Thorpe. "We made John take it in easy stages." "What are 26 miles of good road?" he said. "Not that all of it was good. Famous sport, though. Passing country wagons and such. Driving to an inch, that's my style." "I was heartily glad to travel in the post-chaise," said his mother. "John drives like a madman." Mr. Thorpe's gaze fastened on Jane, and at once he went to her side. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm your cousin John, and you are? Forgive me, I didn't catch all the names." "I am Jane Bennet." He brought forward a chair and deposited himself in it. "John and Jane, I like that. It's a... Now, what would old Professor Bremerton call it?" He winced in an effort to remember. "Alliteration?" suggested Elizabeth. "That's it, a jolly alliteration." His eyes were bright. "I say, you're the prettiest girl. Why the devil are you mending? Haven't you servants for that?" "My sister Lydia needs this for the assembly tonight." "Assembly?" John Thorpe slewed round. "Belle, did you hear? There's an assembly." "If you are too tired to join us, we shall certainly understand," said Mrs. Bennet. "By no means," cried one of the younger daughters. "We adore dancing," said the other. "We have a militia regiment quartered here for the winter months," said Kitty. "There will be plenty of gentlemen to dance with." Elizabeth saw Isabella's lips compress into a line. Lydia also noticed this. "Do you not like officers?" "Ha!" called John. "My sisters are army mad, particularly Belle." "So are we," cried Kitty. "We keep country hours, which might not be to your taste, but it allows our friends to visit in the evening. We have such fun playing cards and games." The younger girls dissolved into giggling. Isabella did not join them. "We have had a bit of disheartening news," Kitty added. "Colonel Forster, who is quite a favourite, is said to be considering marriage." "We have decided to make him change his mind," said Lydia. "Not that we'll be able to do it," said Kitty, "but wouldn't it be lovely if we could?" Miss Thorpe turned to Kitty with an arrested gaze. "Colonel, did you say?" "He is quite the gentleman. Very distinguished in his regimentals. We think he has an estate somewhere." John Thorpe interrupted. "The officers can go hang. It's the assembly I care about." He turned to Jane. "I'll gladly dance with all my fair cousins, but I solicit you, cousin Jane, for the 2 first dances especially." Elizabeth could not believe her ears. This was horrible. How dare he be so forward? Poor Jane. Jane, being kind-hearted, stammered a polite acceptance. "Capital!" he cried. "Dash it all! I don't know when I've seen such a pretty girl as you. A diamond of the first water, that's what you are. It's enough to drive a fellow ravers straight into the matrimonial noose." He burst into laughter. Elizabeth's lip curled. Was this man prone to uncouth speech? "Lizzie," called Mrs. Bennet, "have you finished writing that note to Mrs. Phillips? You must have Ned take it to her straight away." "In a moment, mamma." One thing was certain. Once she dispatched her mother's message, Elizabeth would not leave Jane's side, not even for a minute. Jane was too gentle to give John Thorpe the snub he deserved, so it was up to Elizabeth to turn him away. Later that afternoon, while the family was at dinner, someone vigorously plied the door-knocker. "Of all things to call during dinner is the worst," complained Mrs. Bennet. The housekeeper came into the dining-room. "Well, who is it, Hile?" "It's Mr. Collins, ma'am. He says it was arranged that he would return today." There was instant silence. "You have got to be joking," cried Mrs. Bennet. "No, ma'am. He hasn't dined and is requesting to join the family here. Shall I set another place?" 13 at table. Can there be anything more unlucky?" said Mrs. Bennet crossly. "I suppose we are forced to be civil. I take it he plans to stay for several days. Where shall we put him?" "The back parlour is available, ma'am." "That will do nicely. You needn't exert yourself to see that Mr. Collins is comfortable, Hile. There will be time enough for that when he inherits this house." Elizabeth could not help but notice the surprise on Isabella Thorpe's face. "Depend upon it," said Mrs. Bennet, "Mr. Collins has come to negotiate the settlement for his marriage. I do wish," she added, "that he would have a change of heart and marry one of my girls instead." "An event that is, shall we say, highly unlikely," said Mr. Bennet. "One can always hope," said Mrs. Bennet crisply. "Stranger things have happened. Engagements do not always endure." "There is room, ma'am, for him to be placed beside me," offered Isabella. Mrs. Bennet smiled politely. "That is very good of you, Miss Thorpe. We are sick to death of Mr. Collins. I dare say he will appreciate seeing a friendly face." 4. Caught in the Drift. That night, as Darcy's chaise entered Meryton, Charles was unable to contain his excitement. Even Darcy was not immune to his friend's high spirits. This was plainly ridiculous. Was he a schoolboy to be thrilled at the prospect of dancing with Elizabeth Bennet? Nonsense. An assembly was no reason to be giddy. He was not such a weakling. And wouldn't it figure that they'd returned to Netherfield in time to attend? Naturally, Charles saw this as some sort of sign. Darcy loathed events like this, with the press of strangers and their prying eyes. This assembly would be London's marriage mart all over again, on a smaller scale certainly, but with the same scrutiny, the same speculation about his wealth and social position, and the same tiresome flattery. He knew what people said of him, that he was taciturn, reticent, and even aloof. Why were these considered failings? What sort of man would he be if he lived entirely for the approval of others? All too clearly did he understand where duty lay. The future of the Pemberley estate depended on an heir, yet Darcy also knew that marital unhappiness was entirely possible. Charm and beauty blinded even the most discerning of men to cold, avaricious greed. Even the lovely Elizabeth Bennet was not to be trusted. He must be on his guard tonight. Strains of music came to greet them, and Charles descended from the chaise with dancing steps. "We are only a little late." He made a careful adjustment to his cravat, and turned anxious eyes to Darcy. "Is my hair all right?" "You look very well." "I feel very well," said Charles. "It's a glorious night for an assembly." "So it would seem," said Darcy. The doors came open, and a flood of talk and laughter poured out. Darcy drew a long breath, straightened his shoulders, and followed his friend inside. All too well he recalled the October night when Charles and his sisters had dragged him here. This time who should come rustling forward but Mrs. Bennet? "Why, Mr. Bingley!" she cried. "You have returned to us. You are most welcome, sir, most welcome indeed." Must she be so loud? "And Mr. Darcy, too?" Mrs. Bennet added, with a brittle smile. Charles was in his element, and he greeted each person as if meeting a long-lost friend. Darcy knew what was required, and he nodded politely to those known to him. He then directed his attention to the dancers. He ought to be looking for Jane Bennet, since she was the reason for Charles's return. Instead, across the crowded room, Darcy's eyes found Elizabeth. She was walking through the figure of the dance with one of the officers. 3 weeks ago he had danced with her at Bingley's ball. She was every bit as lovely tonight. An overwhelming feeling of tenderness welled up. Darcy willed it down. This would never do. The dancers took a turn, allowing him a glimpse of the officer's face. Confound it, Elizabeth's partner was George Wickham. Thank heaven Georgiana was safe in London. As usual, Wickham was behaving as if he hadn't a care in the world. Long ago Darcy had learned that the man's friendly demeanour hid a covetous, spiteful heart. Why the interest in Elizabeth Bennet? She did not possess a fortune, and Wickham was always in financial need. It was her beauty. Wickham had always been drawn to youth and beauty, and innocence. And Elizabeth? Was it any wonder that she was charmed by Wickham's appearance of goodness? She had no way to know his true character. Even his old father had been taken in by Wickham's glib lies. Darcy studied Elizabeth more closely. Her smile haunted his dreams, but she was not smiling tonight. Now why was this? He saw her look often to her sister, who was dancing with an exuberant fellow. Jane Bennet wore an expression that was new to Darcy, that of resignation. She was doing her best to be polite, nothing more. She certainly did not return the regard offered by her partner. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet had not been idle. Never mind that her daughter was dancing. She edged her way forward. "Jane, dear," she called, "look there! It's Mr. Bingley." Such was Jane's surprise that she stumbled against her partner, causing him to laugh. Elizabeth's eyes met Darcy's in a startled glance. Wickham turned and caught sight of him. He gave Darcy a caustic look and began talking. There could be little doubt that Darcy was his subject. At length the dance came to an end, and Charles went at once to Miss Bennet's side. Darcy followed. He was near enough to see the soft light that came into her eyes, and her shy smile of pleasure. Even so, she seemed reluctant to take Charles's hand. Jane's former partner stood beside her, glowering. Elizabeth abandoned Wickham and came straight up to him. "Will you dance the next with me, Cousin John?" she said pleasantly. "Our good friend Mr. Bingley has arrived unexpectedly. I expect he would like to dance with Jane. Dash it all, she promised the first 2 dances. I've another one due me. Yes, and you shall have it later. I hate put-offs. I have 4 sisters, Mr. Thorpe. You must do your cousinly duty and dance with each of us." This suggestion was met with a sour look. "And if you do not care for that, I shall introduce you to my friends. Miss King, for example, is without a partner." Darcy saw the man wrinkle his nose. "The ginger-haired girl?" "I would introduce you now, but, dear me, look there. Mr. Wickham has stolen a march on you." "Bravo for him." Elizabeth would not be deterred. She held out her hand. "Shall we?" Still protesting, Mr. Thorpe was led into the set. Sir William Lucas was at Darcy's elbow, eager to shake his hand. "Never mind what the others say. I, for one, am very glad to have you among us again." What in the world? While Darcy was digesting the meaning of this, Mr. Collins came bounding up. "My dear sir, it is a pleasure to see you again." He paused to smile widely. "You will doubtless be gratified to learn that, as of yesterday, your esteemed aunt enjoys excellent health. Also," he added, "you might not have heard that I am shortly to be married." Darcy said all that was polite. "Is this your fiancée?" he added, for a pretty, smiling woman had taken hold of Collins's arm. No, this is my, Miss Thorpe, a charming cousin." The first bars of the next dance sounded. Miss Thorpe playfully pulled at Collins's arm. "Come along, Cousin Willie," she teased. "You cannot be so unkind as to refuse me a dance." "But that is to say, Miss Lucas expects—" "Does she? How amusing for you to be henpecked even before you are wed. But can you help it if you are much sought after tonight?" Miss Thorpe fluttered her eyelashes. Collins was stunned to silence. Darcy hid a smile. This was a very determined young woman. One met them everywhere at London parties. One also met with young men of Mr. Thorpe's stamp. The high shirt points of his collar and ridiculous dimensions of his cravat shrieked of dandyism, although he had neither the height nor the figure for it. The man soon got over his pique and had many a smile for Elizabeth. Once the dance ended, he kept hold of her gloved hand. "You're a dashed good dancer," Darcy heard him say, "and you're every bit as pretty as your sister. I've no complaint to make, none at all. Dark-haired beauties are all the rage in London, you know. You must promise me a second dance." Elizabeth pulled free of his grasp. "Very well," she said. "Perhaps later." For an instant her eyes met Darcy's. Was this a plea for help? Darcy did not hesitate. "Later indeed," he said, stepping forward. "It so happens that the next is promised to me." This was clearly outrageous, but so were Thorpe's remarks. The man was begging for a set-down. While Elizabeth's cousin stood sputtering, Darcy took both her hands in his and gazed into her eyes. He knew he should not smile at her, but he could not help himself. Here was an unhappy truth. He was a thorough-going weakling. The next set was now forming. The musicians played the opening measures. It was now Darcy's turn to claim a sign. Had he not teased Elizabeth about a dance and been refused? How delightful to repeat what he had said then. "Shall we dance a reel?" John Thorpe was bad enough, but now she must dance with Mr. Darcy? Worse, he remembered what he'd said at Netherfield. She had laughingly refused him then. This time she was unable to do so. That was badly done, he admitted, as he led her onto the floor. "Do forgive me. You were in need of rescue." "Rescue? Certainly not. She was stopped by the twinkle in his eye. Who knew Mr. Darcy could look like that? Gracious, was there a dimple in his cheek? "Thank you," she said quietly. The reel began, setting the dancers in motion. Mr. Darcy made his bow, and then said, "Who is that fellow?" "John Thorpe. He is the son of my mother's long-lost cousin." Elizabeth attempted to speak lightly, but was unable to disguise her irritation. Fortunately, she and Mr. Darcy were parted in the dance. Presently she was able to add, "How many cousins I seem to have, of whose existence I was previously unaware. I suppose it is no such thing in your family." "On the contrary, distant relations appear at my doorstep with regularity, and on the flimsiest of pretexts." What new mood was this? Where was Mr. Darcy's disagreeable reserve? "Usually," he added, "their intent is to borrow money, or, failing that, to marry either my sister or myself." What else could Elizabeth do but laugh? Who would have thought she could laugh with Mr. Darcy? When the dance brought them together again, he said, "I should not be saying so in a ballroom, however." "Why not?" "Should not such observations be kept private?" Elizabeth made her turn. "And when, sir, shall I have an opportunity to converse privately with you? This is my only chance." "I see that Mr. Wickham wastes no opportunity." "What do you mean?" "From the looks he sent in my direction, it was not difficult to guess that he was speaking of me." "That is a bold assumption, sir." "I have known him all my life. When I know you better, perhaps I shall share the history of my dealings with George Wickham." As they were now the head couple, they joined hands and traversed the length of the line. This was rather exhilarating. Mr. Darcy was a better dancer than she realized. "But why not now?" she said. "He told me about a living your family promised him, which was never given." She meant to embarrass Mr. Darcy, but the man never turned a hair. He merely smiled and said, "Shall we talk of books instead?" More teasing. But what a difference the smile made to his appearance. Elizabeth had forgotten how handsome Mr. Darcy was. She said, "Miss Bingley told Jane that her brother would not be returning to Netherfield. We thought he would be giving it up." "Yet here we are. Bingley wishes to celebrate Christmas in the country." Elizabeth could not believe her ears. 2 weeks with Mr. Bingley. How wonderful for Jane. Her odious cousin must be endured. Jane's happiness was worth the sacrifice. "Mamma invited the Thorpes to do the same," she confided. "Mr. Thorpe intends to hang mistletoe everywhere." "Ah," said Mr. Darcy, "you had best be on your guard." His eyes were alight with laughter. "Are not dark-haired beauties all the rage?" Elizabeth choked on a laugh. This man was not at all stupid. "So you heard that? I have the misfortune," she said tartly, "to possess relations who are also very loud." She made the final turn, and then a curtsy. "And so ends our dance." Again Mr. Darcy's dimple appeared. "Here comes Thorpe. We'd best have a second before he can put his oar in." A second dance with Mr. Darcy? She had never known him to dance twice with anyone. What would people think? The mulish expression on John Thorpe's face decided the matter. Elizabeth cast caution to the wind. "I am happy to accept," she said. "Moreover, if you should wish it, I shall gladly talk of books." Dancing with Mr. Darcy. Would wonders never cease? 5. A roguish rescuer. "I have never understood," grumbled Charles, "why one cannot make a morning call until well into the afternoon." "Presumably because you would not wish to catch the family at breakfast," said Darcy, "especially on the morning after an assembly." A gust flapped the lapel of his riding-coat. "It looks like rain," he added. "As I said, we ought to have come earlier. But there's no point in crying over spilt milk. Come on." Charles urged his horse into a canter. Darcy followed suit. Longbourn House, built of mellow red brick, stood well in its own land. The surrounding park featured magnificent mature trees, bare against the grey December sky. Beneath one of them, Darcy noticed a flash of colour. He slowed his pace. Whoever it was wore a blue cloak. Something about the woman was familiar. "You go on ahead," he called to Charles. "I'll come presently." Charles reined in. "Horse, cast a shoe," he shouted. Darcy waved him on. Such was Charles's ardour to see Jane Bennet, that he complied without question. Sure enough, the woman was pressed against the trunk of an enormous oak, as if she were hiding from someone. This was a ridiculous impression, but Darcy could not shake it. He could also see that his initial thought was correct. Here was Elizabeth Bennet. He swung out of the saddle and approached her on foot. "Good afternoon," he said quietly. She whirled to face him. "Mr. Darcy!" Her shoulders sagged. Could it be with relief? "Thank goodness," she said. "I thought you were someone else." Darcy's lips twisted into a smile. "A novel experience for me. I am usually recognized at once, no matter how badly I wish to hide." He looked a question. Elizabeth caught his meaning. "If it were summer, and if this were a tree in the orchard, I would be tempted to climb into the boughs. It is a convenient way to remain out of sight." "I see," he said politely. "I take it that concealment is a matter of some importance?" "It is." She paused, as if debating whether or not to continue. "My cousin, whom you met last night, is taking his gig to the stables, and will return with a saddle horse. He intends to give me a riding lesson, whether I want one or not." "You consented to drive out in his gig?" "Nonsensical, I know. But here I am. Forgive me, but after the way he behaved at the assembly—" "I had no choice. Thank you for rescuing me, by the way." "It was my pleasure." "Although you did add fat to the fire by insisting on 2 dances." "But then, so did Mr. Thorpe," he pointed out. Again she sighed. "Most unfortunately." "This does not explain why you agreed to drive out with him." "If I did not offer, he would have asked Jane. He is quite taken with her, and she is too kind-hearted to refuse." "A fellow like that?" "Jane is influenced by Mamma's concern for our future, and—" Elizabeth stopped. "It appears we'll soon have a storm." "What better time to take out the gig?" Darcy was rewarded with a smile. "My cousin meant to hunt for mistletoe, but when he learned that I do not ride, he was overcome. If it begins to storm soon, my lesson will not happen. Never have I been so eager to pray for rain." "How is it that your sister rides, yet you do not? I should have thought that you are an intrepid horsewoman." "I had the misfortune to take a rattling fall. After that, no one was able to convince me to learn." Darcy could teach her. Oh, but he could. "A fall is the fault of the instructor," he said firmly, "not the student." "And with Mr. Thorpe I shall doubtless take another tumble." She put up her chin. "And if you think that I will consent to ride a pony, you are wrong." "A blow to the pride?" She laughed merrily. "Indeed, yes. How like you to guess? I am heartily glad that we do not own a pony, or a saddle horse that will meet with Mr. Thorpe's approval. He is a stickler, you see. And how would you know that? Because he must announce his expertise at every opportunity. Believe me, if I were able to ride, I would steal your horse this very minute and gallop away. Darcy could not help but smile, leaving me to hunt for mistletoe with Mr. Thorpe. It would be very bad of me, but yes, you are right to despise me, Mr. Darcy. Despise her? This could not be farther from the truth. The black clouds looked threatening, and gusts sent autumn leaves scurrying across the lawn, yet Mr. Darcy remained by her side. Elizabeth knew she ought to return to the house, but when she learned that Mr. Bingley had come, she held her ground. Jane must have the opportunity to speak with him. If their noisy cousin were to come barreling into the drawing-room, he would ruin all. Then, too, it was not unpleasant to converse with Mr. Darcy. Apparently, Mr. Bingley planned to invite her family to dinner. "We have no proper hostess," he explained, just as John Thorpe's voice came trumpeting through the trees. "Hello, hello!" With a shiver, Elizabeth turned to face her cousin. But where was the saddle-horse? John Thorpe was driving his gig, and in typical fashion came tearing up to them. Only at the last instant did he rein in. "That fellow, Ned, or whatever his name is, hasn't a proper riding-horse anywhere," he shouted. "Only a slab-faced slug that has no business being called a horse." Mr. Thorpe gave a braying laugh. "So we're back to driving in the gig." He jerked a thumb at Mr. Darcy. "Who's he?" "You met him last night at the assembly." "Him and a score of others? How's a fellow to remember them all? Besides, I took notice only of the pretty women." He reached down to pull Elizabeth into the gig, but it was Mr. Darcy who took her hand and assisted her. Mr. Thorpe's face clouded. "By Jupiter, he's the gent who danced with you, not once, but twice." He lowered his voice. "I'm not sure I like him." "He's Mr. Darcy," said Elizabeth mildly. John Thorpe shifted in his seat. "How do?" he called. "I'm Thorpe, Elizabeth's cousin. A kissing cousin, you might say. Ha ha!" Elizabeth saw Mr. Darcy flinch, and he gave Mr. Thorpe the slightest of polite bows. How delightful that the man knew how to depress pretension. Unfortunately, John Thorpe had no use for social niceties. "What do you think of my gig, Darcy? A neat one, is it not? Curricle hung and town built, too. Not quite the thing for the country, but no one cares for that." To Elizabeth he said, "I borrowed a knife to cut mistletoe. That fellow Ned tells me there's some growing in the apple orchard, as if I know where that is. Mighty unhelpful folk you have here." "The trees are bare, Mr. Thorpe. Clumps of mistletoe should not be difficult to find. The orchard," she added, "is to the south of the house." Mr. Darcy was now mounted on his horse. "I shall come with you," he said. "Bingley is keen to find mistletoe. He is from the north, where it is not as common." "Bingley," grumbled John Thorpe. "Is that someone else from the assembly I'm supposed to know?" "He is Jane's friend, and ours too, of course." "Oh, that chap. Not sure I like him either." "He has taken Netherfield Park until Michaelmas." John Thorpe digested this. "A man of means, is he? Ho, ho, does my sister know about him?" Again he broke out laughing. Elizabeth could not believe what she was hearing. Even Mr. Collins had better manners than this. "I say, that's a fine bit of horseflesh you have, Darcy." Mr. Thorpe dug his elbow into Elizabeth's ribs. "Now that's what I call a horse. If your stables had one such as he, you would have had your lesson, cousin." Mr. Darcy's brows came together in a scowl. "You cannot be serious, surely. This is no mount for a beginner." Mr. Thorpe's only response was to laugh noisily and whip up his horse. "To the orchard!" he cried, as drops of rain began to fall. The light rainfall was a mercy, for it cut short their expedition. Elizabeth's cousin was pleased with his harvest, and he announced his determination to adorn Longbourn House straightway. "Plenty of opportunities to be of use, eh?" he crowed, smiling widely. "So many pretty cousins to kiss. A honeyfall for me." The way he looked at Elizabeth made Darcy's temper boil. Moreover, Thorpe's fondness for neck-or-nothing driving, which he boasted about repeatedly, kept Darcy on the alert. If Thorpe broke an axle and pitched Elizabeth into a ditch, he would have much to answer for. The gig came blazing into the carriage drive, with Darcy close alongside. Thorpe pulled up, jumped down, and helped Elizabeth to do the same. Mistletoe in hand, he went bounding toward the house. Darcy surrendered his horse to the man from the stables and offered his arm to Elizabeth. "I apologize for being ill-equipped," he said quietly. "You ought to have had an umbrella." "I am too relieved to care. The hateful riding lesson did not take place, for which I thank God. This blessed rain," she added, "was an answer to my prayers." Darcy took a step toward the house, but Elizabeth held him back. "I ought to warn you. Mr. Thorpe's sister has been asking questions." His eyes met hers. "Questions," he repeated. "About me?" Now why was he smiling? "I assured her that you are not only proud, but also very disagreeable. In other words, you are not worth her time." "Thank you." "The trouble is, because of your wealth and social standing, she obviously thinks that you are." "I promise to be on my guard," he said gravely. "Will you? May I point out, sir, that it is not in your best interest to smile?" Darcy lowered his voice. "Not even at you?" "Especially not at me. She is the sort of girl who takes pleasure in stealing another girl's suitor." Darcy felt a blush rise to his cheeks. Wonder of wonders, was this how Elizabeth saw him? "Am I your suitor?" he managed to say. "Certainly not. Why should you be? Actually, I am merely saying that Isabella will stop at nothing to—" The sound of an opening door interrupted. "Why, Mr. Darcy," called Miss Thorpe. Darcy choked on a laugh. "Oh dear," said Elizabeth. Her cheeks dimpled adorably. "How lovely of you to call. Do come in out of the rain. I cannot imagine why you are standing out here in this stupid way." "Can you not?" said Darcy. "I assure you I have a very good reason." "You have no such thing," whispered Elizabeth. "Oh, but I do." Elizabeth narrowed laughing eyes at him. "How untruthful you are, and here I thought you prided yourself on honesty." Darcy could not resist. The opportunity was simply too perfect. "Very well," he said, "I'll prove it." With his free hand he cupped Elizabeth's chin. He then leaned forward and gently pressed his lips to hers. He did not immediately pull away. Miss Thorpe gave a cry. "Stay a moment," Darcy murmured, his lips against Elizabeth's. Sure enough, the main door soon gave a satisfying slam. Elizabeth drew back. Her eyes were wide. She was obviously flustered, and so was he. Why on earth had he kissed her? "Thank you for rescuing me," he said. "I shan't have any more trouble with her." "You are not only proud and disagreeable," sputtered Elizabeth, "but you are also a rogue, yes, and a scoundrel too." Darcy felt his lips curve into a smile. "So I am," he said humbly. "You are a good deal worse than Mr. Thorpe." Darcy brushed a lock of damp hair from her cheek. The things a man discovers about himself. "Moreover," she went on, as if he had not spoken, "my sisters were likely spying on us through the window, and heaven only knows who else." Here was a happy thought. "Is Wickham in there? Is he looking out now? I'll gladly return the favour and rescue you from him." "Odious man! I am not in need of rescue, sir, from anyone." "With the exception of Thorpe." Darcy offered his arm. "Shall we go in?" She gave a sigh and tucked a hand under his elbow. "How I'm to face them I do not know." "I should not worry, my dear. Your cousin came in with his mistletoe, and you know how loud he is. The only one who saw us was Miss Thorpe." "Is that not enough?" "Ambitious women do not like to advertise their failures. I have met enough of them to know." He covered her hand with his and added, "I am sorry you disliked the kiss. I am sadly out of practice when it comes to kissing." "I did not precisely." She broke off speaking. "Very well. We shall agree to let bygones be bygones, sir, as long as it never happens again." "Ah," said Darcy, smiling. "I can promise you many things, Miss Elizabeth, but I am unwilling to agree to that." "You are not sorry?" "Come now, what sort of a rogue would I be if I were?" 6. Quite carried away. It took some work to remove the damp gloves, and the ribbon that secured her bonnet was just as troublesome. The drawing-room door came open, accompanied by a wave of laughter. "Lizzie!" cried Elizabeth's mother, "where have you been? Gracious, your bonnet is quite ruined." She closed the door behind her and came into the vestibule. "You girls and your careless ways! There is no end to what I suffer. Lydia has again torn her hem, and, as usual, Sarah is nowhere to be found. Not that Sarah is a skilled needlewoman, but when wanted she always manages to be elsewhere." Elizabeth removed the offending bonnet and set it aside. "I'll mend it for you later, mamma. Here, as you see, is Mr. Darcy." "Oh," said Miss Bennet ungraciously. "Well, good afternoon, sir." Mr. Darcy made his bow. "Can you tell me, ma'am, where Mr. Bennet may be found?" Elizabeth turned on him. "Why?" she whispered. His dark eyes gazed into hers. "I'd like to speak with him for a moment," he said quietly. "No, there can be no reason." Mrs. Bennet interrupted. "Pray do not remind me," she said crossly. "Mr. Bennet can see no one, sir, because he is ill. He has taken to his bedchamber with a shocking cold, given him by one of those Thorpe girls whom I did not invite. I was hoping you were Mrs. Phillips, Lizzie, come to take them away, and now we are quite undone. Mr. Bennet will die, and Mr. Collins will cast us from the house." "Surely not," said Elizabeth gently. "Father was well enough at breakfast." Mrs. Bennet hunted up a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. "But he is not well now, nor shall he ever be again. Mamma, this is all your fault, Lizzie. If you had done as you ought in accepting a certain person's offer, I should never have sent that horrid invitation. Your father could be at death's door, and all those Thorpes can do is laugh and talk of mistletoe. My poor nerves." With a sniff, Mrs. Bennet turned and mounted the stairs. "Should you go to her?" said Mr. Darcy quietly. "Yes, but later. My aunt's listening ear will do the most good. I'll send her up as soon as she arrives." "Is your father's illness serious?" "I think not. He merely wishes to avoid the noise and bother of our guests. No doubt Mr. Thorpe, and Mr. Collins too, have invaded the privacy of his library, forcing him to seek refuge elsewhere." Elizabeth put up her chin. "There is no reason for you to speak with father, sir." Mr. Darcy raised an eyebrow. "But there is. I'd like his permission to call on you." "For goodness' sake, because you kissed me." "Among other reasons, yes." "You have been reading too many romances, which I must say is not at all in character. For your information, a kiss does not create an obligation." Now why was he smiling like that? "Not that I am in the habit of kissing," she added. "It was not my intention to entrap you." "That is refreshingly obvious. You are forgetting that I was the one who initiated the kiss." He lowered his voice. "Shall I take Bingley away? I dare say he is adding to the noise." "No, he is no trouble at all. If you are not afraid for your health, you might as well come into the drawing-room." A dimple appeared in his cheek. Elizabeth sighed. "I could have worded that more graciously," she admitted. "I apologize. I am rather overwrought." "The poets tell us," he murmured, "that a kiss changes everything." "Not because of that. Because of father." He raised an eyebrow. "And mamma as well. I am afraid she dislikes you." "Have I offended her?" "The offence, sir, was against me. Mamma was quick to come to my defence." "A serious charge," he said gravely. "May I know the particulars?" he would ask. "When first we met," said Elizabeth lightly, "you refused to dance with me. You said I was merely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt you." His eyes narrowed in amusement. "I said no such thing." "But you did. You said those very words to Mr. Bingley. I dare say, being a scoundrel and much in the habit of giving offence, you cannot recall it. Wretched man, why must he laugh?" "Becoming acquainted with you has certainly been an experience," he said. Elizabeth gave him a look. He counted out the reasons. "You refuse to consider yourself compromised. You do not wish me to speak with your father. Your mother has taken me in dislike." "Is that so unusual?" He smiled. "Mothers of unmarried women always like me, Miss Elizabeth." "Of all the outrageous things to say." "Just as everyone considers you to be beautiful," he went on, "which is only right, for so you are. And yet when someone, a hapless scoundrel in this case, dares to question that by saying you are tolerable—" There was a twinkle lurking in those solemn eyes of his. Silent, taciturn Mr. Darcy. Today he was anything but. Elizabeth summoned a scowl, but her features would not obey. Why must she smile? "I suspect we are alike in that regard," she told him. "That is to say, insufferably proud." She glanced to the drawing-room door. "We ought to go in." She was unable to conceal her reluctance, however. Mr. Darcy noticed, and he took hold of her hand. "What troubles you?" His fingers closed over hers. It was a possessive gesture, yet warm and reassuring. Elizabeth knew she ought to pull away, but she could not bring herself to do it. "Tell me," he said softly. "I dread facing Isabella Thorpe. She has likely told everyone what she saw. The longer we remain out here together, the worse it looks. Perhaps you ought to go." "And leave you to face the lions alone? Never." Mr. Darcy released her hand and reached for the door latch. "We'll brazen it out together." Together? How had this happened? Why had she allowed him to kiss her? Why was there such fascination in gazing into his face? Without meaning to, Elizabeth took a step toward him. Mr. Darcy released his hold on the latch, a question lighting his eyes. Abruptly, he closed the distance between them, and boldly pressed his lips to hers. This time his arms enfolded her in a tender embrace. What was she doing? Kissing Mr. Darcy, a man she thoroughly disliked. Anyone might come in and see them, but apparently he did not care. Nor, it seemed, did she. Was she so thoroughly wanton? What must he think of her? At length she pulled away. "We should not be doing this," she whispered. "Not without speaking to your father." "Not ever. What must you think of me? I must never kiss you again." "I'll see that," he murmured, and promptly pulled her against his chest. This time Elizabeth eagerly raised her face to meet his. Only the sound of movement above the stairs ended the kiss. Her fingers lingered on the lapel of his coat. "You are damp from the rain." This nonsensical statement was accompanied by a very foolish smile. "There is no harm done. Not to my coat." He leaned in to whisper into her ear. "The damage to my heart is another matter." Would he kiss her again? Elizabeth lifted her eyes to his, counting heartbeats. She ought to object. She ought to send him away. Being a rogue, would he meekly do as he was bid? She thought not. Why did she find this idea so thrilling? The sound of an opening door interrupted. Elizabeth stepped away from Mr. Darcy just as Mrs. Hile came into the vestibule. "Mamma is in her bedchamber, Hile," she managed to say. "When Mrs. Phillips arrives, would you take her up? Oh, and when you have a moment, Mamma would appreciate a pot of tea. Yes, miss." Mr. Darcy opened the drawing-room door. "Courage," he whispered. "Here we go." Elizabeth drew back her shoulders and went in ahead of him. Sure enough, Miss Thorpe's eyes followed her as she crossed the drawing-room. When Mr. Darcy settled into a chair near Elizabeth's, her expression soured. But she said nothing to either of them. Elizabeth dared not gaze in Mr. Darcy's direction, but she could not help herself. There he sat, silent and reserved. Here was the man she was accustomed to seeing. But those kisses, He was as deliberate in them as he was in everything else. This man's fearsome restraint, she now realized, concealed a passionate, loving nature. Sure enough, when Mr. Darcy's eyes met hers, they were warm with affection. Was she falling in love with Mr. Darcy? How was this possible? 7. What new horror? There was no longer any question about the growing affection between Jane and Mr. Bingley. What a delight to see them together, sharing smiles and laughter. Even though Mr. Darcy said little, Elizabeth could tell that he was pleased. Was it not a wonder to better understand him? After he and Mr. Bingley took their leave, John Thorpe made a push to interest Jane in a game of cards or in working a puzzle. Each time he was smilingly refused. At length he gave up and retreated to a seat near Elizabeth's. "Hi-ho, cousin. What say you to a walk about the gardens? We ought to hunt up sprigs of holly." "It is raining, Mr. Thorpe," she said flatly. "As if you care for that. I have an umbrella we can share." Elizabeth gave him a speaking look. "What a pity that you did not bring it during our drive. I prefer to remain here, thank you." "Confound it! A fellow cannot stay cooped inside all day." "I suggest you make the best of it. We have a selection of books." "Books?" he scoffed. "I've had enough of those at school." He sent a smile in her direction. "Your mamma was pleased to see us drive out together." "I ruined my bonnet, much to her displeasure. Moreover, she is upset about father's illness." Isabella leaned forward. "Is he very ill?" Her face was a picture of concern, but there was no mistaking the interested sparkle in her eyes. "Mamma seems to think so," said Elizabeth mildly. "If that is the case, I marvel that she accepted Mr. Bingley's invitation for tomorrow. Surely she should remain here to care for him." There was a pause. "Perhaps you ought to do the same, dear Elizabeth. I dare say your presence would be a comfort in your father's hour of need. Your sisters tell me that you are his favourite." A series of sneezes came from the corner where Meg and Sally sat. "Would you not, for similar reasons, prefer to go with your sisters, to stay at my Aunt Phillips's?" said Elizabeth. "And risk catching their cold? Heavens, no!" Isabella turned to her brother. "If you are looking for something to do, you might take Meg and Sally into Meryton." "3 in a gig, in all this rain? No, thank you." "You have an umbrella," Elizabeth pointed out. Before John Thorpe could reply, his sister spoke up. "Do tell me about Netherfield Park," she said sweetly. "Is it very grand?" "I think it is," said Elizabeth. "But then I have been told that mine is a provincial opinion. Tomorrow you may judge for yourself." "And Mr. Darcy's estate, is it equally as fine? I have heard that he is very rich." Elizabeth did not like the knowing look in Isabella's eyes. "As to that, I have no idea," she said lightly. "Others say he is, but we know how inaccurate rumours can be." She rose to her feet. "I ought to go up to father." Jane turned away from the windows. "I'll come with you, Lizzie." As they ascended the stairs, Elizabeth linked her arm through Jane's. "It is an inconvenient time for father to be ill. I suspect that Mr. Bingley is eager to call on him." "Oh, Lizzie," whispered Jane, "he likes me. He truly does. I dare to hope that I am the reason he returned." "Of course you are. His heart would not allow him to stay away." Elizabeth longed to confide about Fitzwilliam Darcy, but for some reason she held back. Who would believe that her opinion could change so entirely? Mr. Bennet was willing to admit them. To Elizabeth's surprise, he was not in a chair but propped in bed with a mustard plaster. Books were scattered on the coverlet, unopened. "You are not reading?" "I have the headache. I am quite content here, my dears, for it is blessedly quiet. I should have known that any cousin of your mother's would talk incessantly. As for that fellow Thorpe—" "Mr. Bingley came to call, father," said Jane. "Did he? Has Mr. Darcy intruded as well? When one comes, so must the other." "Well, yes," said Elizabeth. "Poor Lizzie, your altruism on Jane's behalf is admirable, my dear. Mr. Darcy improves on further acquaintance." "Does he? Your cousin Isabella will like that." This caught Elizabeth off guard. "How so?" "Mr. Darcy is as disagreeable as she is coquettish. They should deal admirably together." "You misunderstand me. I do not object to Mr. Darcy's company." "Oh, has he supplanted Mr. Wickham? Is there to be kissing in the moonlight?" "Not in the moonlight, no." "I stand corrected. The clouds will cover what little moon there is." Mr. Bennet began to laugh, which set him to coughing. Elizabeth shared a look with Jane. Their father's illness was no invention. At length his cough subsided. "Never fear. If tiresome Mr. Darcy does come to ask for your hand, I'll have my refusal ready." Dinner without Mrs. Bennet and the two younger Thorpes was certainly more peaceful. Later, when Hile came into the drawing-room to announce the arrival of the officers, Lydia gave a cheer. "At last! Now we shall be happy." "Half a moment, Hile," said Elizabeth. She turned to Jane. "Should we receive them without Mamma being present?" "Don't be missish, Jane," pleaded Kitty. "They are our particular friends. Of course it is all right." "What nonsense! I am here to act as duenna," announced John, "and so is my mother." Jane hesitated. "I'll go up and make Mamma come down," cried Lydia. "Perhaps the officers can cheer her up." "Since Mrs. Thorpe is with us," said Jane slowly, "I suppose there can be no objection." "Hear, hear!" cried Mr. Thorpe. Lydia gave a whoop, and Mrs. Hile returned to the vestibule. "Perhaps," said Isabella smilingly, "we shall discover whether your friend the Colonel is engaged." "Pray do not remind us," cried Kitty. "That would be tragic indeed." "Not necessarily. Engagements, you know, do not always last." "Of course they do," said Lydia. "It isn't as if a fiancé of his would cry off." "But he might," said Isabella. "Shall I like these officers?" "Oh, yes, especially Lieutenant Wickham," said Kitty. "He is our favourite." "Belle is fond of captains," crowed Mr. Thorpe, "or better yet, colonels." He gave a wink. "John, really?" she cried. Elizabeth took out a book and opened it. She had lost her taste for discussing the men of the militia. George Wickham was the first to enter the drawing-room. He made a graceful bow to the ladies. "Mrs. Thorpe is our hostess tonight because Mamma is unwell," said Lydia. "Have you met our cousin, Miss Thorpe?" added Kitty. "Indeed, yes. We danced together at the assembly." Mr. Wickham sent a wide smile in Isabella's direction. John Thorpe came forward to shake hands. "I dare say we were introduced, but, dash it all, a fellow cannot be expected to recall so many names, aside from those of the prettiest ladies, of course." The officers joined him in laughter. It was not long before Mr. Wickham took a seat beside Isabella. This was hardly surprising, given the smiles she sent in his direction. Presently Elizabeth heard the name Darcy. Was Mr. Wickham relating stories of his childhood, including the abuse he'd suffered at the hands of the Darcy family? Apparently so, for their heads were close together. Mr. Wickham certainly wasted no time. Refreshments were brought in. Mrs. Thorpe poured out, assisted by Isabella. Elizabeth adhered to her book. At length she looked up to see Mr. Wickham. He placed a chair opposite hers. "If there is something worth knowing," he said cheerfully, "you are my best informant." She turned a page. "I rather doubt that." "My dear, I know you better than you know yourself." Lydia followed, and she plumped down on the sofa beside Elizabeth. "What do you want to know?" "Why, I am merely wondering whether your charming cousin is an heiress." Clearly, he expected Elizabeth to laugh with him. She did not. "Do you mean Isabella?" said Lydia. "According to what her mother has told Mamma, her father was in a very good line of business, so yes, I dare say she is." "Lydia, really?" whispered Elizabeth. Don't be so prim. Lydia turned to Mr. Wickham. My sister thinks inquiries of this sort are in bad taste. But how else is a girl to know? Or a gentleman, said Mr. Wickham, smiling. Speaking of inheritance, I did hear that Miss King has lately received a windfall. Is there any truth in that? Has she? Cried Lydia. How much? £10,000, if the rumours are to be believed. She will need every penny, poor girl, said Lydia. Who could like her? Isabella's voice interrupted. 10,000, you say? She gave a toss of her head. What is that to me? She passed a cup and saucer to Elizabeth and said, Here you are. At once Mr. Wickham surrendered his chair and placed another for himself. Isabella settled into it gracefully. Rumour has it, he said smoothly, that you are an heiress, Miss Thorpe. Isabella shrugged a careless shoulder. My great-uncle left me an independence, she said, including a house. The light in Mr. Wickham's eyes was unmistakable. How delightful! Do tell us more about it. It seemed to Elizabeth that her cousin's smile slipped. Another time, perhaps, she told him. Isabella then rose to her feet. Do forgive me. I ought to assist Mamma with the coffee. Mr. Wickham's eyes followed her. He was definitely intrigued. After the officers departed, Lydia pressed Mrs. Thorpe for details. Old Uncle Oliver took a fancy to our Isabella, laughing and flirting as old men will do, she said. He died a bachelor. 2 months ago his house came to her. I received a set of keys from the solicitor, said Isabella. Can you imagine the fun? Though her tone was light, Isabella's eyes did not smile. Why was this? The house is let to tenants, added Mrs. Thorpe. Or have they moved out? I cannot recall. Will you live there when you marry? Said Kitty. Goodness, no, said Isabella. It is rather in need of renovation. I have better uses for my money. How lovely to have an independence, said Lydia. Is your money invested, as the novels say, in the 3%? Her Uncle Oliver had shares in a Jamaican plantation, said Mrs. Thorpe. She should receive the first quarterly payment after Christmas. Why, it is like something out of a fairy story, said Kitty. Elizabeth was not convinced. The set of Isabella's mouth told a tale of its own. Some time later, Elizabeth found the gown of Lydia's that needed mending. Mr. Collins was living in the back parlour, so she sought refuge in the empty dining room. This was not the best idea, as it was quite dark. However, several branches of candles were on the table. It would be no trouble to light them. As Elizabeth pulled out a chair, her sewing-box dropped to the floor. The strawberry pincushion came out and went rolling beneath the table. With a sigh, she dropped to her knees and crawled after it. The dining-room door came open. I tell you, she heard Isabella say, this is the opportunity I have been waiting for. Elizabeth froze to silence. Mr. Bennet is ill, Isabella went on. His wife expects that he will die. You must help me, Johnny, please. The door closed behind them. To do what? Said John Thorpe roughly. You and your fine inheritance, crowing like a cock on a dunghill, weren't you? Over a dilapidated house beneath Fulham Bridge? I'd rather die than live there. You own it free and clear, my girl. Better than the pile of mortgages our dear papa left behind. Who cares if it ain't a fashionable address? Those shares in that plantation haven't done you any harm. Father's shares have never amounted to much. However, it is pointless to argue. We must work together. John Thorpe pulled out a chair and sat. That Wickham is certainly an eyeful. Reminds me of your fine captain. What was his name? Ah, yes, Tilney. Isabella gave a cry. I never wish to hear his name again, as well you know. You fancied him, my girl. You've a soft spot for a rogue, especially an officer. A lieutenant in the militia is hardly an officer. Moreover, Mr. Wickham hasn't an estate. Are you sure about that? He spoke of that place in Derbyshire as if it were his own. Gracious, no, it belongs to Mr. Darcy. You have never been one for listening. Dashed lot of bother listening, unless it's something a pretty woman says.
Stay to the point. Mr. Collins is due to inherit Longbourn, perhaps very soon.
He's not much to look at. Granted, neither was Morland. I helped you with him, and a fat lot of good it did me. No sooner caught than you took a fancy to me.
Johnny, is your heart set on being a parson's wife? Mr. Collins will not always be a parson. He will have all this.
You were willing to marry Morland for 400 a year. Isabella cut him off.
Look around you. There is nothing here that is shabby. The furnishings, the clothes they wear, even the quality of what is served at this table. Everything is first-rate.
True enough, he admitted. If the Longbourn estate brings in a penny less than 2,000 a year, I'll eat my hat. But to get it, you've got to detach Collins from that Lucas woman. If she's worth her salt, she'll hang on like grim death.
That is where you come in.
I get him to break it off? How is that supposed to happen? No, my girl, I won't have any part of it.
Just take her driving, John. She walks everywhere. Surely you can befriend the creature?
Well, I won't.
Flirt with her, charm her, make her laugh and smile, and I shall make certain Collins sees.
There was a pause.
Think of what it will mean. You will not be left with Sally and Meg and Mamma on your hands. There is plenty of room for them here.
By Jove!
There is much in it for you. Marry one of our cousins. It doesn't matter which. We might as well keep the money in the family.
I'll help, said John Thorpe slowly. But if it all goes wrong, I won't be made to marry the Lucas woman. There isn't any money in it, for one thing. Collins was boasting of how noble he is to take her on for a mere 1,000. And for the other, she is not only plain, but downright ancient. 27, I think Collins said. The thought of kissing her makes me shiver. There was more along these lines, much more. Elizabeth was sickened by the greed of her cousins. The conversation was cut off when Hile and Sarah came in to set the table for supper. Elizabeth remained where she was. At an opportune moment she took hold of the offending pincushion and crawled out from beneath the table. This was dreadful. These two must be stopped, but how? To whom could she confide their shameful plan? Not Jane, not Charlotte either, for she would not believe it. The answer came rushing in like an ocean wave, sweeping aside shame and disgrace and every other objection. Fitzwilliam Darcy. 8. A giddy thing. Days were short at the waning of the year, but this one promised to be fine. Darcy had Challenger saddled and went out for his morning ride. During Elizabeth's stay at Netherfield, she often walked through the park before breakfast. Would she do the same today? Darcy was discovering that when it came to love, even the slimmest thread became a beacon of hope. To his delight, he caught sight of her in Longbourn's park. She was pacing back and forth before the enormous oak. Was she waiting for him? Darcy covered the distance at a gentle canter, although his heart longed to ride pell-mell. In his place, Charles would have jumped down to greet his Jane with smiles and kisses. Darcy remained on his horse. "Good morning, my love," he said quietly. Elizabeth's gaze flew to his face. Heavens, the poor girl was as bashful as he. "About yesterday," she stammered, "Shall we seek a more sheltered spot? We are in full view of the house." Elizabeth's reluctance was palpable. "Is that wise, sir?" "Is anything about this wise?" he countered, smiling. She drew a long breath. "I suppose not." Darcy pointed with his riding crop. "I recall seeing a bench on the other side of that hedgerow." "Yes," said Elizabeth. "I'll ride off and then circle back. Meet me there." "Very well." How well he understood her shyness. Was she worried that theirs was a passing flirtation? He would do his best to reassure her.
It was odd, however, that she should not recognize the hardened flirt in Wickham. Then again, her experience with men of his stamp was limited. Darcy was first to arrive at the bench, and he spread a clean handkerchief on the seat for her. He then removed his hat. From the depths of the hedgerow came the rustling of small birds. They were eager for rowan berries at this time of year. Elizabeth sat down in silence. "There's a fine fellow," said Darcy, indicating a bird. "I have always liked redwings, with their distinctive eye stripe." "Do you? I have never thought of you as one who appreciates animals." "That is hardly surprising, since we have met only in drawing-rooms. I have lived most of my life in the country. I brought bits of apple for Challenger. Would you like to give them to him?" Elizabeth agreed, and Darcy rose to his feet. She showed no fear as he led Challenger to the bench. "He is very beautiful," she said slowly, offering the apple. "The correct term for a horse is magnificent, is it not?" "I believe so, yes." Darcy stroked Challenger's shoulder. Challenger soon finished the apple and began tearing at the lawn. Darcy resumed his seat. They sat side by side, neither daring to break the silence. Elizabeth's embarrassment was unmistakable, so was his, and yet his heart would not be silenced. "Come now," he said at last, "we might as well admit the truth. Since October you and I have been captivated by one another." "Captivated? No, indeed. I disliked you amazingly." "In the beginning, yes, but later. You were as intrigued as I, not because of my status or fortune, or," he added, "due to my abundance of personal charm." He was rewarded with a sharp sigh. "Have you always had the annoying habit of being in the right?" She looked fleetingly into his eyes, and then away. This gave him courage to continue. "Yesterday," he went on, "our pent-up feelings pushed to the surface. After that there was no holding them back. One might as well attempt to restrain the rising tide." "But passion is often deceptive. She stopped. "I ought to have used a different word." "No, you are in the right of it," he said quietly. Elizabeth pressed her hands to her cheeks. "This cannot be happening. We cannot be having this discussion." "I understand your reticence. Please believe me that this is as new to me as it is to you. If you distrust me, or believe you are mistaken about my character—" "Not at all. On the contrary, as a suitor you are perfection. Heaven on a plate, as Cousin Agatha would say. And never did I think," she went on, "that I would become one of those silly girls who lurk in passageways longing for a kiss." "Nor do I wish to figure as the cad who forces one. On the other hand, my love—" "There is a rational explanation, Fitzwilliam. There must be. John Thorpe was a perfect beast yesterday, teasing about mistletoe and being my kissing cousin. He must have put the idea into my head." "Thorpe made you wish to kiss me?" "No. You were kind and protective, and you came to my rescue. I somehow lost perspective, that is all." "What if," said Darcy, leaning in, "the feeling between us is sincere? Do we discard it because we are afraid?" "No," said Elizabeth in a small voice. "I have been in love with you for weeks, Elizabeth. I returned to London, taking Bingley with me out of fear, both for him and for me. How was it possible that such an overmastering affection could take root and flourish in so short a time?" "You parted Charles Bingley from Jane?" "I was convinced that his feelings were a passing fancy. I have seen him in love before, and it has never lasted. But he decided to return against the counsel of his sisters, and at the outset against mine." "You did not wish him to court Jane?" "If I succeeded in parting them, would his love be genuine? Yet here he is, by his own design and intent. He is as eager to speak to your father as I am." A ghost of a smile appeared. "I never knew you could be so impulsive, sir."
I have never been in love before. For a time," he added, "I was afraid that you would fall in love with Wickham." Her head came up.
"Heavens, no. Last night he came to call, and I heard him telling Isabella the same stories. Your great injustice to him, his blighted future, and so forth. They had only just met, yet there he was, pouring out confidences."
"Wickham declined to take the living my father promised, and was suitably compensated."
"So what he told me were lies?"
"You and I would say so. However, Wickham believes the lies he tells, and this makes confrontation difficult. His resentment against me is lifelong. Moreover," he went on, "last spring I foiled an elopement scheme. His object was my sister's fortune."
"But surely she is too young."
"She was but 15, he said quietly.
"How monstrous! Your poor sister."
"Georgiana has a kind and trusting heart. She was completely taken in. You know how charming Wickham can be."
"I loathe money, and most especially the greed it can cause."
"That is abundantly clear. It is one of the things I love in you."
"You do not know the whole of it. Last night I overheard John and Isabella making plans. Fitzwilliam, she is a viper. She would happily part Jane from Mr. Bingley or me from you, simply to obtain a fortune."
Darcy gathered Elizabeth's hands in his. "I have met her kind in London countless times."
"I am fond of hyperbole, as you know, and my opinions are impertinent and marked by self-interest. My younger sisters also are not very wise, but we do have a sense of right and wrong. What Isabella said last night made me shiver. She is without conscience, Fitzwilliam. She has no fear of God or anyone else. I have never met someone so shameless."
"Aside from Wickham."
"You have not yet heard the worst. She is determined to break up Charlotte's engagement, so that she can marry Mr. Collins and become mistress of Longbourn."
Darcy drew a long breath. "Collins is an easy mark."
"Very much so. His marriage to Charlotte is one of convenience. To be honest, it is not to my liking. She is throwing herself away on a man like him. But Isabella's greed knows no bounds. She has enlisted her brother's help. To do what, I dare not think."
"Tonight's dinner should be enlivening, to say the least."
"Will John Thorpe attempt a seduction? You may well laugh, but it is possible. Loathsome man."
"We shall allow him no opportunity to be alone with her. Although, may I just point out that—"
"That what?"
Darcy sighed. "I'll do everything in my power to help. But if Collins is bowled over by Miss Thorpe, I do not see how you or I can check him."
"There must be a way. You, as a man, have a better understanding of these things."
He gave her a look. "I do, and therein lies the problem. Has a girl like Miss Thorpe come much in Collins's way?"
"I have no idea. Until November he was a perfect stranger to us."
"A beautiful woman, expressing open admiration, is a powerful inducement. Many a wiser man has been toppled by less." He bit back a smile, and then added, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships, and burnt the topless towers of Ilium?"
"Do you mean Helen of Troy? That is ridiculous."
"It is, rather," he said. "Until recently I should not think such a powerful love was possible."
"Should I confide what I know to Charlotte? Put her on her guard, so to speak?"
"If Collins is the certain person your mother mentioned, whose offer you so wisely refused, will your warning be suspect?"
"I'm afraid so. Who knew an engagement could be so complex?"
"Ours is refreshingly straightforward. Speaking of which—" Darcy shifted his position. His hat rolled from the bench to the ground. Elizabeth's eyes widened.
"What are you doing?"
"Something I ought to have done days ago." He lowered himself to one knee and took her hands in his. "My heart," he said simply, "I love you dearly. Will you take me on as husband, in spite of my many deficiencies?"
Were there tears in her eyes? "No one will believe that I love you, Fitzwilliam. Not even father. I have not been silent about my dislike of you."
"The lady doth protest too much, methinks," he quoted, smiling.
"Moreover, everyone will say I am marrying you for mercenary reasons."
"Does it matter? We know the truth."
"But what if I am? Aren't you even a little worried? For years Mamma has been drumming into my head the need to marry well."
"With good reason, apparently," he said mildly.
"It is just that I do not want you to be disappointed, Fitzwilliam. My father was captivated, intrigued, as you say, by my mother's beauty and high spirits. That feeling did not last."
"I'll take my chances." Darcy touched her cheek. "This bonnet," he whispered, "is very much in the way."
"Fitzwilliam, no. If I kiss you again, I'll be lost to propriety."
She gave another sigh.
"I should not have said that, but you know what I mean."
"I do." His fingers pulled at the ribbons, a possessive gesture. Would she object?
"Can there be such a thing as too much honesty?"
she whispered. "Not between us, my love." Elizabeth's eyes studied him for a long moment. Slowly she loosened the knot and lifted the bonnet from her head. Here, then, was her answer. Darcy's heart nearly burst for joy. 9. Hey-ho. Isabella Thorpe paged through a book and then cast it aside.
"I have read this one before," she said. "Horrid Mysteries is deliciously exciting, but I long for something new." "We haven't time to walk to Clark's," said Elizabeth. "Perhaps your brother can drive you into Meryton tomorrow?" "Is that the bookseller's? Has your father an account there?" "Clark's is the subscription library. Father rarely purchases novels for us." "How shabby!" "I wonder," said Elizabeth. "Once one has read a novel, one quickly loses interest." "What I wonder," countered Elizabeth, "is why your mother insists on coming with us to Mr. Bingley's dinner. Your dear father is so dreadfully ill. Should she not remain behind to comfort him? I wonder the same about your mother. Should she not do likewise for your sisters? They have merely caught a trifling cold. It is most unfair that they have been excluded." Elizabeth rose to her feet and went out into the vestibule. "Hey-ho! Stay a moment, cousin," called John Thorpe. "You are beneath the mistletoe. You owe me a kiss." Elizabeth stepped back and lowered her chin. "I think not, sir." He caught hold of her shoulder. "How can you cast aside so ancient a tradition?" She pulled free of his grasp, all too easily. He lowered his voice. "Come now, my inheritance is hardly contemptible. Neither is yours. Mamma has told me the whole. You could do much worse than make a match with me, you know." Was this a proposal? "I'll take my chances, thank you." He shook his finger at her. "You owe me a kiss. I shan't forget." Elizabeth turned on her heel and made for the staircase. She must speak with her mother at once. There was little sympathy to be gained from that quarter. "John Thorpe is becoming quite fond of you," said Mrs. Bennet. "You should use this to your advantage, my dear." There was nothing to be gained by mincing words. "Mamma, what did you say to Mrs. Thorpe? Her son is under the impression that my sisters and I shall inherit a fortune." "Bless me, it has been years since we discussed the subject. You cannot expect me to remember everything." Elizabeth folded her arms across her chest. "I might have given her that impression when you were babies. Your father and I had always planned, as you know, to have a son and end the entail." "In other words, you lied to her." Mrs. Bennet gave a cry. "I most certainly did not. That sort of thing is not considered a lie, Lizzie. It is merely an exaggeration." "Did Mrs. Thorpe tell you that her son is well off?" "She probably did. Her husband was in a very good line of business. Everyone knows that." "And yet I heard John Thorpe complain that their house in Putney is mortgaged." "You heard no such thing. Mamma, He is planning to marry one of us to make up for the loss. But, Lizzie, why did you invite them? Mrs. Bennet brought out her handkerchief. It was for your sake. Someone must consider your future, since you will not. My cousin has always spoken of her son in such terms. Has she? He is hardly an Oxford scholar. When you refused to marry Mr. Collins, I had no choice. And now your father is ill. He has a cold, as well you know. That is beside the point. Should the worst happen, Charlotte Lucas will turn us from the house as soon as may be. Charlotte would never be so cruel, but I can think of another who would not hesitate. Mr. Collins, of course. Why did he not propose to marry instead? Mrs. Bennet disappeared behind her handkerchief. Oh, Lizzie! Was there any point in telling her mother about Isabella Thorpe's plan? It would likely make everything worse. You ought to tell Mrs. Thorpe the truth. How can I? It is too late for all that. You are mistaken. It is never wrong to be honest. Why do you delight in tormenting me? My poor nerves. How am I to compose myself before we leave for Netherfield, I do not know. I dare say you shall find a way. There was no point in saying anything more. The Thorpes were not happy to learn that the Bennets' coach would make 2 trips to Netherfield, and that they would be arriving last. I expect you could find room for me, complained Isabella. Indeed we could not, said Lydia. It's bad enough that we must sit smash against one another without you adding to the crush. Your sister Elizabeth should remain behind and come with us, suggested John. His expression was nothing less than a leer. It is only 3 miles to Netherfield, said Elizabeth. It shall not be a long wait. John Thorpe's gaze slanted toward the bough of mistletoe. Not long at all, he agreed. If I were the one driving, it would be accomplished in much less. The sound of his laugh made Elizabeth's blood boil. What a braggart! It seemed that every window in the Netherfield mansion was alight, a welcome sight on such a cold and dreary evening. Mrs. Bennet was first to come into the entrance hall. Why, Mr. Bingley, Christmas Eve has come early. And so it had. Sprigs of holly were tucked here and there. Swags of evergreen and rosemary adorned the mantelpieces. Where had Mr. Bingley managed to find hellebore in bloom? This is very grand, whispered Mary to Elizabeth. Mr. Bingley must have spent a fortune in candles. Lydia dug an elbow into Jane's side. Look there! We know what that is for. Sure enough, from the entrance hall's ceiling hung a conspicuous branch of mistletoe. Mr. Bingley was all smiles. He seemed even happier than when he had hosted his ball. To Elizabeth's relief, Fitzwilliam Darcy was less effusive. Their love was too new. She was shy of parading it before friends and family. Even so, it was delightful to see the warm affection in his eyes. The others went ahead into the drawing-room. Elizabeth held back, and so did Mr. Darcy. "Today," she whispered, "I promised to marry you." That you did. His lips curved into a private smile, shared only with her. "It seems incredible." "Indeed, yes." His voice took on a formal tone. "I beg leave to inform you, ma'am, that there will be no getting out of it. I shall not let you off." Elizabeth had no desire to be let off, and she said so. "Everyone will be very surprised," she added. "Bingley most of all. I agreed to remain for only a week. Our objective involved his heart's desire, not mine." Elizabeth lowered her voice. "Speaking of desire, John Thorpe tried to lure me beneath the mistletoe today." Mr. Darcy's brows descended. "Did he?" His sudden irritation was delightful. "I do not see why he should wish to kiss me," she added, "given his plans for Charlotte." "Shall I call him out?" Was this what gentlemen did? "Surely you are funning." He gave her a measured look. "Would you?" Again his smile appeared. "Not if I can help it," he admitted.
After all, Thorpe is your relation. It could be awkward if I wounded him. Then, too, I have no knowledge of his skills as marksman.
He hasn't spoken of shooting, and we both know that if he were an expert, he would talk endlessly on that subject.
So I am safe.
From Mr. Thorpe, but not, dear sir, from me.
I have no wish to be kept safe from you. She glanced toward the drawing-room door. Surely they would be missed.
Fitzwilliam, she whispered, what are we to do?
Your father's health should improve shortly, and then everything will come out in the open. He lowered his voice. As to what happens next, I have a little plan. The pieces are not yet in place, so I am not able to tell you of it.
But
Lydia came out of the drawing-room with their mother in tow.
Lizzie, there you are, she cried. It's the most delightful thing. We're to have games after dinner instead of dreary conversation. Jackstraws, and I do not know what else. And then Mr. Bingley will build up the fire so that we can sit around and sing carols together.
She paused.
Of course, he shall be sure to sit beside Jane.
Such a triumph, added Mrs. Bennet, to see our Jane established as mistress here, the dearest wish of my heart. Her smile slipped. Good evening, Mr. Darcy. Must her mother be so odiously snubbing? Come along, Lizzie, she said crisply. Mr. Bingley brought with him a selection of carols, but I dare say Mary is unable to play most of them. You must do what you can. Elizabeth exchanged glances with Mr. Darcy, and obediently went into the drawing-room. 10. Come hither. There was a little stir when the party from Lucas Lodge arrived, along with Mr. Collins. "Is Miss Thorpe to join us this evening?" Elizabeth heard him say. "With her brother and her mother," said Mrs. Bennet. "But they must come later on account of our coach being so crowded." "I see," said Mr. Collins politely.
"How surprised we were to learn that Isabella is an heiress," added Kitty.
"Is she indeed?"
"That's right," said Lydia. "One of her ancient relations, I forget who, left her a house, along with shares in, is it a gold mine? Do they have gold mines in Jamaica?"
"Gracious me," said Mr. Collins. Elizabeth did not know where to look. Trust her sisters to speak openly on such a subject. She withdrew to a corner of the drawing-room. Fitzwilliam Darcy came near with a book. The library here is in deplorable shape, but I was able to find Marlowe. I thought you might enjoy the context of what we discussed earlier. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes at him. The face that launched 1,000 ships? He opened the cover and found the page. Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss.
Immortality, said Elizabeth, has nothing to do with kissing.
Not according to this. Once he recovers enough to speak, he says, "Her lips suck forth my soul. See where it flies?"
Her lips do what?
He laughed softly. I thought you would appreciate that line. Elizabeth gave Mr. Darcy's arm a thwack. He did not seem to mind. Poor Faustus. On top of every other bad decision, he is subjected to a soul-sucking kiss.
I do not believe that is in Marlowe at all. You are making it up.
He held out the book. Careful, the pages are rather mouldy.
I wonder that you can read them.
But there is more. Come, Helen, come, give me my soul again. Here will I dwell, for heaven is in these lips. Today, he added, I discovered that this is very true.
For heaven's sake, lower your voice.
I'm merely reading lines from a book. There can be no harm in that.
You are impossible.
No one regards us, Elizabeth.
Perhaps it would be better if we simpered and smiled, like Jane and Mr. Bingley.
It would not be half as much fun. He closed the book.
Fitzwilliam, she said, you must tell me of your plan. What do you intend to do?
It could well be impossible. I do not wish to disappoint you.
Gracious, what have you done?
Nothing more than write to my solicitor. He might not have time to carry out my instructions.
Elizabeth caught sight of Charlotte coming toward her. Their conversation would soon be at an end.
"Do I not deserve even a hint?"
His private smile appeared. "Would you object," he murmured, "to spending Christmas at Pemberley?"
"But how?"
With a twinkle he moved away, leaving Elizabeth to Charlotte's company.
"There, you see," said Charlotte, "I have rescued you from Mr. Darcy."
But Elizabeth had no desire to be rescued. How could she tell her friend that her opinion of him had changed in every way? Such a thing was useless. Charlotte would not believe it. Presently the Thorpes arrived and were announced. Mr. Bingley returned to the drawing-room with a wide smile.
"Nichols tells me that all is in readiness. Since this is an informal party, I'll leave you to choose your seats."
Into the dining-room they trooped. John Thorpe soon exchanged his seat for one beside Charlotte. Mr. Darcy assisted Elizabeth with her chair, and then took the seat on Charlotte's other side. Presently the first course was served.
"Well now," announced John, "this is very nice. It ain't often a fellow has such pretty dinner partners."
He beamed at Charlotte. She coloured up. Elizabeth understood it. Compliments did not often come Charlotte's way. "I understand that you are to be married, Miss Lucas," said Mr. Darcy gently. "When do you go into Kent?"
"At the beginning of January, sir."
"Kent?" cried John Thorpe. "You'll be hiding your light under a bushel there, my girl." Elizabeth was determined to change the conversation.
"Are you fond of travel, Mr. Thorpe?"
"Dare say I am, although not to places that appeal to a lady. Thistledown Gap is more my style." He leaned forward to address Mr. Darcy.
"Were you in Rutland last year, to see Crib and Molyneux? Famous good fun that was."
"I was not," said Mr. Darcy. Now why was his tone so sharp?
"Your loss. Prime entertainment, I call it."
"Indeed," said Charlotte politely. "A theatrical performance?"
"Bare-knuckle prize-fighting, Miss Lucas. No holds barred, no quarter given. I'll never forget when Crib broke Molyneux's nose, blood everywhere. How we cheered."
Elizabeth studied her plate. How mortifying that this audacious man was her relation. Mr. Collins's voice came from across the table.
"I do not consider novels, such as those you mention, Miss Thorpe, to be proper reading for a young lady."
Elizabeth glanced up. Isabella's face was alight with laughter.
"I think you would enjoy them, Mr. Collins. Tomorrow you may judge for yourself. You shall read to me from Fordyce's sermons, and then I shall read to you from horrid mysteries." "Books," called Lydia. "What are books to dancing? I do wish we could dance tonight. Wouldn't that be jolly?" "Alas," said Kitty, "there are not enough gentlemen." "Then we must invite the officers to come tomorrow."
Meanwhile Mr. Thorpe continued his conversation with Charlotte.
"Brutality," he scoffed. "It was nothing of the sort. Crib and Molyneux were fighting for a purse, my girl. That's how it is in life. A chap takes his risks to win a prize. The bigger the prize, the greater the risk."
He boldly winked at her. "It seemed to me," said Mr. Darcy, "that Molyneux was treated unjustly. It was hardly a fair fight." He turned to Charlotte. "Do tell me about your brothers, Miss Lucas," he said pointedly. "I understand that one of them is away at school."
"Richard is at Harrow, yes."
"Does he enjoy his studies?" Mr. Bingley's voice came down the table.
"Actually, Darcy leaves for London on Saturday, unless I can convince him to remain. What say you, Darcy?"
"Why, then, you must spend Christmas with us, Mr. Bingley," cried Mrs. Bennet. "We cannot have you here all alone."
"Thank you, ma'am. I have invited Caroline and the Hursts to join me. Here's hoping the weather holds so that they will consider coming." "You shall have far more fun with us," crowed Lydia. "Besides, you are not the only one to hang mistletoe." "I'll second that," said John Thorpe. "Huzzah for mistletoe!"
Out of the corner of her eye, Elizabeth saw him drain his wine-glass and motion for more.
"Don't mind if I do,"
he said. On top of everything else, was the man a drunkard? At the conclusion of dinner, Mr. Bingley cheerfully led the way into the drawing-room. This meant passing beneath the mistletoe, a point not lost on John Thorpe. "Hey-ho! The best part of this season," he cried. "Miss Lucas, you owe me a kiss." Charlotte was taken aback. Come, he insisted. "It's Christmas." Charlotte politely offered her cheek, but John Thorpe had other ideas. Boldly he pressed his lips to hers, for a little too long. He had the audacity to laugh. "Might as well have a real kiss before you marry that prosy old stick." Needless to say, Mr. Collins was not pleased. After everyone was seated before the fire, Elizabeth noticed Isabella whisper urgently into his ear. Mr. Collins did not join the others in singing carols. Grim-faced, he sat with his arms crossed and scowled at Charlotte. It was no better after they all returned to Longbourn. "A first-rate Christmas dinner," proclaimed John Thorpe as he came stumbling into the vestibule. "Roast goose, mince pies, and the most delicious puddings." He paused to laugh. "That Bingley, my word, he spares no expense when it comes to wine." Elizabeth froze to silence, praying that he would go up to bed. "Are there any takers for under the mistletoe?" he called, laughing some more. "One good kiss deserves another." When there was no reply, he went lumbering up the stairs. Isabella not only joined them in the drawing-room, but she had the nerve to defend her brother's behaviour. "Really, Cousin Elizabeth, your opinion is absurd. John did nothing wrong. Miss Lucas encouraged him. We all saw it." "Why, there could be some truth in that," said Mrs. Bennet. "I've always thought Charlotte Lucas to be a sly, deceitful creature." "She is nothing of the sort," cried Elizabeth. "I think she fancies him," said Isabella. "After all, there is no smoke without a fire, as they say. What is that supposed to mean? Why, merely that Miss Lucas wished to kiss my brother, just as you wished to kiss Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth's younger sisters broke into laughter. "What a fib!" cried Kitty. "Elizabeth hates Mr. Darcy. Everyone knows that." "What will you say next?" added Lydia. "That you've been kissing Mr. Wickham?" There was more laughter. Colour stained Isabella's cheeks. "And what if I have?" "You wouldn't dare," said Lydia. "He is our particular friend, not yours." "I shall do as I please," said Isabella. "Now and always, you'll see." 11. Stepping Stones. Overnight the weather turned, frosting Longbourn's windows with fern-like patterns, and blanketing the park in white. Elizabeth drew on her cloak with determination. She knew by now that he would not fail her. Sure enough, in the faint winter sunlight, she could see Challenger waiting next to the oak. Beside him, Fitzwilliam Darcy paced back and forth. She came straight to him, and he enfolded her in an embrace. "Propriety constrains me from sharing what is in my heart," he murmured. "You manage very well without words, sir." There was no longer any doubt, or shyness, between them. He pulled her behind the oak's massive trunk and kissed her. "As if this is any concealment," she protested. "I rather enjoy our secret meetings. Now then, how is your father?" "Jane and I thought his illness was a mere invention, but through the door we can hear him cough, a deep, racking cough. He is truly ill, and this change in the weather does not help." "When I come today, will he see me?" "He hasn't been seeing anyone, but I shall ask." Elizabeth smiled up at him ruefully. "I should warn you, he thinks I dislike you intensely." Who knew Mr. Darcy had such an adorable lopsided smile? "I shall do my best to overcome his prejudice," he said gravely. Elizabeth fingered his lapel. "We did not succeed very well last night, did we?" "With the Thorpes. They are a determined pair, and Collins is what one would call a sitting duck." "Charlotte will be unhappy married to him. But if he were to break the engagement in favour of Isabella, her reputation would be ruined.
Let us hope his fear of Lady Catherine's disapproval will deter him from such a step. If not, I am quite willing to remind him. Fitzwilliam Darcy's severe practicality was no bad thing.
He is remarkably foolish, Elizabeth said, but he is not entirely depraved. I suppose flirting is a new experience for him.
I could say the same.
If my sisters have their way, there will be dancing tonight, so perhaps Isabella will lose interest. You know how poorly Mr. Collins dances.
Fitzwilliam Darcy's eyes were warm. I would enjoy dancing with you. Elizabeth could not suppress a smile.
At one time I vowed that I would never do so, but now everything has changed, simply because of a kiss.
Love sought is good, he said gently, but given unsought is better. His lips found hers. Shakespeare and kissing made a delightful combination. Presently, Elizabeth settled comfortably against his shoulder.
I ought to tell something of our news to Jane. I dare say she will not believe me.
As to that, I should inform my sister as well.
Does she live at your family's estate?
Not entirely. At present she is with her companion in London, and with me when I am there.
You have a house in town?
He smiled. I thought you knew that.
I know very little about you, Fitzwilliam. Much of my knowledge comes from rumours.
His smile widened. An accurate source indeed.
Pemberley could well be a tumble-down ruin, beset by mortgages, but no, that cannot be right. Caroline Bingley spoke highly of it, and we both know what a stickler she is. Shall I like Pemberley?
I hope so. The house is rather imposing, but the natural beauty of the grounds is dear to my heart.
And what of your plan for Christmas? Have you news from your solicitor?
Not yet, my love. I hope to have what I requested by tomorrow.
And still you tell me nothing. Shall you come this evening? I ought to warn you that Mamma has asked the officers to after-dinner coffee.
Do you think I would stay away on Wickham's account? Charles was unable to escape a dinner invitation from Mrs. Long. Given his eagerness to see your sister, you can expect us to call in the afternoon.
He has accepted Mamma's invitation for dinner on Friday. Perhaps.
Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks.
Perhaps we shall have an announcement?
The dearest wish of my heart. What else could Elizabeth do but kiss him again?
I should go in, she said at last. It is fearfully cold.
When you depart from me, he said softly, sorrow abides, and happiness takes his leave. Elizabeth could not help but sigh. Handsome, well-read, and able to quote Shakespeare at will, this man never ceased to surprise and delight. Her fingers and toes were half frozen, and her face was pinched by the cold, but Elizabeth smiled all the way back to the house. The others were late in coming down to breakfast. Later they drifted into the drawing-room and gathered before the fire.
"So pretty, the frost," said Kitty. "Shall we have snow for Christmas, do you think?" "Gad, I hope not," said Lydia. "It might keep the officers away." "Nonsense," said Isabella. "They are soldiers. A little frost should not deter them, unless, of course, they deem that you are not worth the trouble."
Elizabeth drew a long breath. Trust Isabella to come to dagger-drawing with Lydia and Kitty so early in the day. Mr. Collins joined them before the fire. In his hand was a volume Elizabeth recognized, taken from her father's library. Apparently he was keen to read a selection from Fordyce. He announced this to Isabella. She showed him a laughing face.
"Look here, cousin."
She held up a volume of her own.
"I have found Udolpho. Prepare yourself to be entertained."
"I rather doubt that," he said stiffly. John Thorpe came across the room and cast himself into an overstuffed chair. "Udolpho? What rot! I never read novels myself. I have something else to do." Mr. Collins gave him a thin smile. Novels are full of nonsense," he went on. "There hasn't been a tolerably decent one come out since Tom Jones, except The Monk. I read that the other day, but as for all the others, they are the stupidest things in creation." "I quite agree," said Mr. Collins. "The tender minds of our ladies must be guarded from dangerous ideas, such as one finds in novels."
"I think you must like Udolpho," said Isabella. "It is deliciously exciting."
"Not I, faith," cried John Thorpe. "If I read any, it shall be Mrs. Radcliffe's. Her novels are amusing enough. They are worth reading, some fun and nature in them."
"Udolpho was written by Mrs. Radcliffe," Elizabeth pointed out.
"No, sure, was it? I remember, so it was. I was thinking of that other stupid book, written by that woman they make such a fuss about." Mr. Collins gave a huff of displeasure. "Women authors." Isabella was not to be deterred. With her prettiest smile she opened Udolpho.
"Prepare yourself for a shock, Cousin Willie. We'll begin with Chapter 1. After that you may read from your sermon."
Over the top of the pages she fluttered her eyelashes at him. Mr. Collins was left with nothing to say. Elizabeth almost felt sorry for him. 12. To be sure. As promised, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley did call on their way to the Longs. When Elizabeth's mother learned about their dinner plans, she pursed up her lips. To Elizabeth's relief, she said nothing more. Mary was working her way through the Coventry Carol in stops and starts. Elizabeth went out and crept upstairs to her father's room. He was asleep. This was both a mercy and a disappointment. There would be no marriage announcement today. She returned to the drawing-room to find Fitzwilliam Darcy beside the pianoforte, intent on turning pages for Mary. He looked up, a question lighting his eyes. Elizabeth gave a tiny shake of her head. No one noticed this exchange. Who knew a secret love could be so delightful?
"Mary," complained Lydia, "no one wants Christmas carols. You ought to practice dance tunes." She turned to Mr. Bingley. "The officers are coming tonight by special invitation. We shall roll back the carpets and dance. Oh," she added, "you must come and dance with Jane. Mrs. Long will not mind if you leave early. Old ladies are always longing for bed."
"Lydia," said Elizabeth.
"And you must play for us, Lizzie. Mary is sure to make a botch of it."
Lydia began counting on her fingers.
"We need enough gentlemen for dancing, because Meg and Sally will be here. Gad, and so will Charlotte Lucas, so that makes 8. 4 officers, unless they can entice Colonel Forster, which I dare say they can, plus our 2 cousins. That's only 7. Someone will have to sit out."
She sent another smile in Mr. Bingley's direction.
"So you see, you are needed here."
Mr. Bingley, quite properly, did not commit himself. As soon as they departed, Mrs. Bennet gave vent to her feelings. "The Longs? Why am I not surprised? Mrs. Long was always the slyest creature, but nothing can come of it." She turned to Mrs. Thorpe with a smile. "Her ambition is to secure dear Mr. Bingley for one of her nieces, but we know his heart belongs to another. Mr. Darcy, however, should be on his guard."
"He has never shown the slightest interest in either of the girls,"
said Elizabeth. "He has never shown the slightest interest in anyone. Detestable man."
"He is hardly that, mamma,"
protested Elizabeth. This was dismissed with a sniff and wave of the hand. During dinner, Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Thorpe continued to discuss the plans for that evening.
"What a pity," said Mrs. Thorpe, "that Edward is away at Merchant Taylor's, and William is at sea. They would be keen to dance."
"And who are they?" said Mrs. Bennet politely.
"Why, my brothers, of course," said Isabella.
"You have a brother at sea?" Mrs. Bennet was unable to hide her astonishment.
"Surely you recall my 2 younger sons?" said Mrs. Thorpe.
"Why, no. To have a son at sea."
"He must make his way in the world, the same as Edward. Let me tell you, the position at Merchant Taylor's was a godsend."
But is there not enough fortune too? John Thorpe interrupted. A topping fellow is old Taylor. Edward's in a snug situation, let me tell you, and William, being clever, is sure to win prize money and advance through the ranks. Mrs. Bennet looked down the table to Elizabeth. Good gracious, she whispered. At length dinner concluded, and the other guests arrived. Elizabeth could not help but notice the constraint between Mr. Collins and Charlotte. Not that they had ever been affectionate, but the change was marked. Then again, perhaps she was mistaken. She must be. How she missed Fitzwilliam Darcy's level-headed observations. How she missed having him here as her ally. John Thorpe was eager to help push back the furniture. "Capital! Capital!" he cried. "A jolly way to spend our time." As the evening progressed, he was not shy about expressing his enthusiasm. While everyone danced the reel, he had the bad manners to hoot and cheer. Several of the others followed his lead. An enjoyable gathering was quickly becoming a rout. Nor did Isabella confine her smiles to Mr. Collins. She was markedly friendly to George Wickham, of all people. There were glances aplenty for Lydia and Kitty, too. Was Isabella deliberately flirting in order to spite them? Presently Mr. Wickham came to the pianoforte to request a dance. Elizabeth did not hesitate to refuse. "As you see, I am committed for the evening." "Come now, that is no fit answer. Miss Mary can easily take your place. I warn you I shall not be dissuaded." Although Mr. Wickham smiled charmingly, all Elizabeth could think of was his cruelty to Fitzwilliam's young sister. How had she ever thought him handsome? She turned a page and spread her fingers over the keys. "I suggest," she said lightly, "that you keep your breath to cool your porridge." Mr. Wickham laughed and wandered away. As the next set formed, Elizabeth saw Charlotte take a seat against the wall, while Mr. Collins gleefully led Isabella to the head of the line. At the end of the evening, Elizabeth took him to task. "My behaviour with Miss Thorpe?" said Mr. Collins. "What can you mean?" "You gaze at her often enough. Why is she continually by your side?" "We are merely talking, nothing more." "I suggest you confine your conversation to your fiancé." "But that is considered rude, as well you know." "People will talk, Mr. Collins. They will say you are flirting with Isabella." "And what of Miss Lucas? She danced with Mr. Thorpe willingly enough, twice." "Because you would not stand up with her more than once." Mr. Collins drew himself up. "I did not wish to slight the other ladies." "That is not how it appeared." "People may say what they like. I'll have you know that I meet with Sir William's solicitor tomorrow." "Have a care that he does not upbraid you for your treatment of his daughter." "Pah!" said Mr. Collins. "He is gratified to have me become his son-in-law. As well he should, for Miss Lucas's portion is woefully small." A smile twisted his lips. "I am quite the matrimonial catch." "What a thing to say!" cried Elizabeth. "Must I remind you, sir, that pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall?" "Your warning is entirely unnecessary, for the opinion is Miss Thorpe's," said Mr. Collins serenely, "not mine." The following day brought no improvement, either to Mr. Bennet's health or the Thorpes' behaviour. Late in the afternoon, Sarah came running with news heard from the Lucas's maid. Kitty and Lydia brought her directly into the drawing-room. "Mamma, you'll never believe what has happened. Tell her, Sarah." "It is about our cousin John," added Kitty in a low voice. In general, Sarah was diffident, but not today. "According to Ruth, ma'am, Mr. Thorpe caught Miss Charlotte walking home from Meryton, and took her up in his gig." "There is nothing remarkable in that," said Mrs. Bennet. "Charlotte Lucas walks everywhere." "Yes, ma'am, but when he handed her down, he kissed her. Right in front of Mr. Collins he did, plain as anything, Ruth says. And then, ma'am, he laughed and drove away." Elizabeth could see that Sarah had more to say. "What did Mr. Collins say to this?" "That's just it, miss.
Ruth says that there was a big row at Lucas Lodge, such shouting and carrying on, and later, Mr. Collins refused to sign the settlement papers, that's what. Ruth thinks he's ended the engagement."
"John," cried his mother, "what have you done?" Mr. Thorpe spread his hands. "Nothing, nothing at all. Have a care. Miss Lucas is the daughter of a knight. There could be trouble." "Rubbish. I am in no danger, mamma." "You should not be flirting with a young woman who is engaged." He laughed. "As to that, you'd best read your lecture to Belle." "I would hate to put dear Mr. Walton to the trouble of extricating you from another situation." John Thorpe's expression soured. "Dear? Old Walton ain't dear to me. Wrote me a demmed terse letter." "Apologize to Mr. Collins." "Well, I won't. What's it coming to when a fellow cannot kiss a girl at Christmas? I was just being neighbourly, giving Collins a hint, in fact. Nobody's seen him kiss her, not even under the mistletoe. John, really." Presently Mr. Collins came storming in, harumphing and pacing about. "I was grossly deceived in Miss Lucas's character," he announced, with a glare to John Thorpe. His behaviour made the remainder of the day quite uncomfortable, for everyone but Mrs. Bennet.
"Lizzie," she called, "play something cheerful for us. There is no reason for moping about. Good Christian men rejoice, or joy to the world will do." She turned to Mary. "You should be sitting with Mr. Collins, my dear. Ask him to read another sermon to you." Mary folded her arms across her chest. "I have no intention of interrupting his conversation with Miss Thorpe." "This is no time to be missish," hissed Mrs. Bennet. "You must take advantage of the opportunity before you." "To align myself with a man who breaks an engagement?" Mary whispered back. "I think not."
"Ugh!"
cried Mrs. Bennet. "Stupid girl!" She scowled at her daughters in turn. "Why will none of you do as you ought?" 13. Out of his senses. Darcy and Charles Bingley had dined with the officers the night before, save for Wickham, who had cried off. This morning Elizabeth came to meet Darcy at the Oak. Seeing her like this had come to mean more to him than almost anything. She had news. All was at an end between Mr. Collins and Miss Lucas. "If I were not so mortified by Mr. Collins's behaviour," she added, "I would laugh for joy, because Charlotte has escaped an unhappy union. Mr. Collins hasn't a thought for the harm he has caused her. As soon as the hour is decent, I'll call at Lucas Lodge. Not that I wish her to take him back, but she deserves the support of her friends." "Has Collins proposed to Miss Thorpe?" "Not yet, although I dare say she is expecting it to come soon. That wretched girl! She glides about the house, smugly possessive in a way that Charlotte never was. She even rearranged my mother's trinkets on the mantelpiece." Darcy bit back a laugh. "Among women, I believe this amounts to a declaration of war." "Mamma was furious, and yet not all has fallen ill with Isabella's plan." "That is only to be expected. What happened?" "Last night father came down to dinner." "Excellent." "Fitzwilliam, you should have seen Isabella's face. She was astonished to see him looking so well." "I am delighted to hear it." "Moreover," Elizabeth went on, "once Mr. Wickham came, she avoided Mr. Collins." "So that is where he was," said Darcy. "He declined Bingley's invitation to dinner." A dimple appeared. "You might like to know, sir, that I have been eclipsed as his favourite." He shared her smile. "By Miss Thorpe?" "The very one. She and Mr. Wickham flirted wickedly. Do they think Mr. Collins is too stupid to see?" Overconfidence has long been one of Wickham's failings. Unpaid debts should soon catch up with him, and then he will disappear. "What can be his interest in Isabella? He cannot think her an heiress." "I believe it is a case of any port in a storm. Then, too, Wickham not only enjoys oversetting the plans of others, but also being first in a lady's affections. Speaking of which, I think he has been describing Lady Catherine to her.
I can well imagine it. My aunt has her faults, but she is one of the few to see Wickham for what he truly is. Her driver once thrashed him for throwing rocks at her coach.
Why am I not surprised?
I am heartened that your father is better, because I must speak to him today. Darcy paused. You will not like what I am about to say next. I was hoping it would not come to this.
What is it?
I am obliged to leave for town tomorrow.
What?
I am sorry, my love, said Darcy quietly. I promised Georgiana to be away for only a week. When Bingley and I come for dinner tonight, I intend to announce our engagement, or better yet, to have your father do so. I shall not stay away long. She nestled against his shoulder.
Our secret love will be a secret no more. I hope you will not be disappointed.
What else could Darcy do but put his arms around her? Never, he whispered, leaning in for a kiss. Elizabeth returned to the house just as her mother came down.
"Bless me, it is cold this morning," said Mrs. Bennet. "It feels as if it might snow."
"I hope not." Fitzwilliam did not need more trouble when travelling to London. It hurt to think about him being away, even for so short a time. Elizabeth followed her mother into the dining room. John Thorpe was at the table, attacking a loaded plate.
"A famous bag last night, was it not?"
he said around a bite.
"Indeed it was," said Mrs. Bennet pleasantly. "When am I to wish you joy?"
He broke out coughing.
"Good gad! What for?"
"Why, when Charlotte Lucas becomes Mrs. Thorpe."
"Me? Marry a Thornback like that? I think not."
"My dear boy, you have little choice in the matter. People are already talking."
"What's it to me if they do? Upon my soul, can't a fellow kiss a girl at Christmas without his head being put in the noose?"
He speared a piece of ham. "My interest lies in a different corner." He gave a sly look to Elizabeth.
"A capital thing, this marrying scheme, but not with the Lucas woman."
"You shall do very well together," said Mrs. Bennet. "She is much better suited to the life you'll offer, whatever that may be. I dare say she will enjoy being situated in a place like Putney." Elizabeth slid into a chair and selected a piece of toast. She kept an eye on the clock.
"Miss Lucas is kind and very good-natured always," added Mrs. Bennet. "What's it to me if she is?"
"Why, it is so much pleasanter to have a cheerful wife."
"A cheerful income is more to the point."
Elizabeth's mother had the grace to admit that this was very true. John Thorpe became occupied with emptying and then refilling his plate. Presently he remarked,
"What a pity that we did not come earlier in the autumn. This is fine country. There is famous good sport to be had here.
My husband does not often take out a gun."
"No shooting parties?"
"Not a one." Mr. Thorpe needed no other encouragement. He began to describe such parties in which he had killed more birds, though without having one good shot, than all his companions together.
"What can be better than a day with the foxhounds?" he crowed. "My foresight and skill in directing the dogs has repaired many a mistake made by even the most experienced huntsman."
Elizabeth took another bite of toast and gazed out the window.
"Not to mention the boldness of my riding," he went on. "Though it has never endangered my own life for a moment, I've led others into difficulties which, I must confess, have broken the necks of many."
John Thorpe went on like this for quite some time. Elizabeth bore with his endless conceit without comment. How could she ever have thought Fitzwilliam Darcy proud? Even Mr. Collins's boasts seemed moderate. Presently the clock showed a more favourable hour, and Elizabeth rose to her feet.
"If you'll excuse me," she said politely, "I must call on Charlotte." "Oh, to tell her I won't marry her?"
Elizabeth refused to acknowledge this remark, and made for the door. She heard John Thorpe push back his chair from the table. He caught up with her in the vestibule as she was wrapping up against the cold.
"You cannot believe what your mother said, do you? As if I would marry that creature."
"I am perfectly willing to believe anything of you, Mr. Thorpe."
He smiled widely. "Now that is more like it. It was not meant as a By Jupiter!" he cried, cutting her off. "Are you meaning to walk? I'll give you a lift. In fact, I'll do better than that." "No, thank you. It is not far to Lucas Lodge." "Dash it all, give a fellow a minute. Why are you in such a confounded hurry?" "I doubt Sir William will be pleased to see you." "Nor I him. Do you think I would go in? You stay put, cousin, and I'll get that turnip-pated fellow to pole up the gig. By Jove," he added brightly, "I'd do well to leave a letter." What on earth did he mean by this? On second thought, Elizabeth had no wish to know. "Then I suggest you get to it," she said lightly. Out she went. It was very cold, with the occasional snowflake drifting down, but Elizabeth did not care. Fortunately, John Thorpe did not follow. The snowfall intensified, hissing against the gravel beneath her feet. Just as she reached the end of the carriage drive, she discovered a stone in her shoe. The lacing of her boot was wet, and in order to unfasten the knot, she had to remove her gloves. This process took some time, and all the while she had the uncomfortable feeling that John Thorpe would find her. Soon she heard the grind of wheels and the sound of a horse. She fastened the lace, stood, and shook her skirts to cover her feet. As usual, Mr. Thorpe was travelling at a brisk clip. When he saw her, his horse was checked with a violence which almost threw him on his haunches. "Hi-ho! Here I am at last!" "Your coming is entirely unnecessary. I did not expect you to take so much trouble." "Not expect me? That's a good one. And what a dust you would have made if I had not come." He jumped down to hand her up. It was then that she noticed a corded trunk strapped to the back of the gig. "I've got to make a run into London," he explained. "I might as well do it now before the weather turns bad." "But it is beginning to snow." "As if I care for that." "How long shall you be away?" "Who knows? A few days, possibly a week or more." Relief rolled over Elizabeth in a wave. What delight to have this man gone from the house. "You will not be frightened," he said as he handed her in. "If my horse should dance about a little, he is full of spirits, playful as can be, but he knows his master." He climbed in and set the gig in motion. "This equipage is altogether the most complete of its kind in England," he told her, as if she had not heard it all before. "My horse is the best goer, and myself am the best coachman. You are in good hands, dear Lizzie." "Please do not call me that." "I'll call you whatever I damned well like." He whipped up his horse, and soon they were bowling along. "Do slow down, you'll shake us to pieces." "Oh, curse it! This carriage is safe enough if a man knows how to drive it." Elizabeth slewed round in her seat. "Look there! You've missed the lane to Lucas Lodge. Turn back." He burst out laughing. "But we are not going to Lucas Lodge." "Mr. Thorpe, I am in no mood for jokes, nor do I wish to go into Meryton." "We are not going to Meryton. We are going to London, more particularly to one of those knacky little inns along the London road." "What are you talking about?" Again he laughed. "A week spent in my company, dear Lizzie, and you will be forced to marry me, whether you like it or not. Even your father will have to agree." "You are abducting me?" "We're eloping." "In a gig? Romantic, ain't it?" "I beg to disagree. Put me down at once." "Well, now, that's something I cannot do. I told you I had to write a letter. Your mother won't find it until dinner, and by then it will be too late." Elizabeth eyed the road. The gig was hurrying along at a fearsome rate. If she were to leap out... John Thorpe guessed her thought and took hold of her shoulder. "No, you don't, my beauty." "You're hurting me." "I'm not offering Spanish coin," he said roughly. "We'll be married right and tight. My father's friends will negotiate the terms. Handy thing having solicitors for friends. Your dear papa will have no choice but to hand over your share of the fortune." "Fortune?" she cried. "What fortune?" "As if you didn't know. My mother told me all about it." "What your mother told you is a lie. Good gracious, it is snowing harder. Turn around at once. You'll never make it to the first coaching stop." Oh, won't I? 14. By their right names. It was snowing lightly when Darcy set out from Netherfield, but he gladly would have faced a blast of flurries. The arrival of a packet from London settled everything. In order to put his plan into motion, he must see Mr. Bennet at once. As he and Challenger covered the distance, Darcy hummed a tune. Longbourn's housekeeper informed him that Miss Elizabeth had lately gone out, and that Mr. Bennet had not yet come down. "It is imperative that I see him, ma'am," Darcy told her. "You are Mrs. Hile, are you not?" She bobbed a curtsy. "I am afraid that I must insist. My business will not wait." "I shall inquire, sir." Darcy was brought into the drawing-room to wait. Elizabeth's mother and sisters were there, along with Wickham and another officer. Collins and Miss Thorpe were seated before the fire. Of her brother there was no sign. Darcy went directly to them. "I understand that there has been a contretemps involving your betrothal to Miss Lucas," he said to Collins. "I advise you, for your own sake, to reconsider." Miss Thorpe put up her chin and gave a speaking look to Collins. "I mean no disrespect, sir," said he. "None at all. Quite the contrary. You honour me with your magnanimous condescension." This reply was not to Miss Thorpe's liking. "What business is it of yours?" she cried. "It is very much Lady Catherine's business," said Darcy crushingly. He turned to Collins. "No doubt she is expecting you to wed the daughter of a knight. If you think you can pull the wool over her eyes, you had best think again." Collins began stammering. I made a little mistake, that is all. Anyone would. It happens all the time." "In so doing, you have displayed to my aunt the instability and unreliability of your judgment." "It is no such thing," squealed Collins. "She, instructed me to find a gentlewoman, and so I have. I shall simply be substituting one lovely young woman for another." "Have you informed Lady Catherine of this change?" said Darcy. "Why, no. It hasn't yet been 24 hours. I advise you to do so at once. You would not like her to hear of it from another source. News of this kind grows wings." This was all it took to send Collins scuttling away for pen and paper. Isabella Thorpe was not happy. "How dare you?" she spat. Darcy did not so much as acknowledge her presence. Mrs. Hile approached with the news that Mr. Bennet was asleep and should not be disturbed. "I am willing to wait," said Darcy. He withdrew to a chair on the other side of the drawing-room. Collins's seat was soon occupied by Wickham. Miss Thorpe began pouring out her woes into his listening ear. "Good morning, Mr. Darcy," said a quiet, musical voice. Darcy looked up to see Jane Bennet take the chair opposite his. "Did you enjoy your evening? Mr. Bingley told me that he had asked the officers to dinner." "Yes, although I expect Bingley would much rather have been here with you." Jane Bennet blushed prettily. "We look forward to hosting you today." Mrs. Bennet's voice cut across the hum of conversation. "What did you say, Hile? Found behind the clock in the dining-room?" Darcy saw the housekeeper give her a folded packet. "Sarah found it while she was dusting, ma'am." "Addressed to me," said Mrs. Bennet. "Most irregular." She broke the seal, unfolded the page, and began to read. "Who is it from?" said Lydia Bennet. "John Thorpe, and, upon my word," she cried, "how dare he? What wickedness!" Mrs. Bennet's breathing became laboured. At once Darcy was on his feet to offer a steadying hand. "If you'll just sit down, ma'am." "Sit down?" she shrieked. "How can I sit down at a time like this? He has eloped. That wicked John Thorpe has eloped with our Elizabeth." "I beg your pardon," said Darcy blankly. She held out the letter. "He says so right here." "That's a lie," cried Miss Thorpe. "John would never marry her." Darcy scrutinized the letter. "Thorpe writes that such is his intention." He looked up. "How long ago did Elizabeth depart for Lucas Lodge?" "How did you—"
How long has she been gone?"
"I have no idea," faltered Mrs. Bennet. 30 minutes or more." "My dear, you must be mistaken," said Mrs. Thorpe. "Our John would not ever—"
"Oh, wouldn't he just?" said Mrs. Bennet, firing up again. "From beginning to end you have brought nothing but trouble, you and your daughters, who I must say were not invited to join you. They carried illness to this house and to my husband on purpose." Mrs. Thorpe gave a cry of protest. "And now your detestable son has brought shame to us all."
"My dear," said Mrs. Thorpe, "there is no need to be so dramatic." "She has good reason, ma'am," said Mary gravely. "The scandal of an elopement will attach to all of us. No one shall be able to escape it."
Mrs. Bennet was struck by the truth of this. "My poor girls! How can they marry? What gentleman will align himself with such a household now?"
"Even our Jane's future is in peril,"
Mary calmly pointed out.
"Oh, Jane, my dear sweet Jane, all your brightest hopes are blighted. And, Lydia, what officer will have you now?"
Mrs. Bennet disappeared behind her handkerchief. Mrs. Thorpe gave a gentle laugh.
There, my dear, you are overwrought. It cannot be as bad as you suppose."
Kitty came rushing in.
"Sarah says that Mr. Thorpe's room is empty. Even his trunk is gone."
Mrs. Bennet's sobs stopped abruptly. She turned to Mrs. Thorpe with a martial glint in her eye. "Get out," she said. "Take your iniquitous children with you."
"What do you mean?"
"You must leave Longbourn at once."
"Now, in the middle of a snowstorm?
It scarcely snows at all."
"But where shall we go? You cannot cast us into the street."
"Hire a chaise and return to Putney," said Mrs. Bennet, "or take yourselves off to the Red Lion. It matters not to me." Isabella Thorpe came striding across the room.
"You dare?"
Mrs. Bennet pulled herself to her full height.
"Indeed I do. This is my house, you wicked girl, not yours."
Isabella Thorpe's voice was dangerously sweet.
"You will regret this," she said. "I shan't forget, not ever. One day you will be made to be sorry, won't she, William?"
Darcy looked up to see Collins standing inside the drawing-room door. How much had he heard?
"My dear Miss Thorpe,"
he began. Isabella stamped her foot at him.
"Oh, you will say nothing while that old witch insults me? How can you allow it, you who will one day be head of the family?"
"But you see, my girl, that's just it. I am not yet." Isabella cut him off.
"You care nothing for me, nothing. You are all against me, every one of you."
"But, Belle, dear—" Meanwhile, Jane Bennet wept softly.
"Poor Lizzie, what shall become of her?"
Darcy went over to Jane. "I'll find them. They cannot have gone far. When things quieten down, reassure your mother."
"But it is snowing."
"Only a little. I'll be able to track them quite easily. The snow will aid me." Jane's tear-filled eyes met his.
"I had not thought of that, but Mr. Thorpe is an intrepid coachman."
Darcy allowed himself to smile. "He is no match for my challenger. Let Thorpe curse and whip up his horse. God willing, I'll catch up handily and we'll bring our Elizabeth home before anyone is the wiser." Meanwhile, the confrontation among the others had risen to a fever pitch. Even Wickham entered the lists. "If you will not defend her," he said hotly to Collins, "I shall." Isabella burst into tears and buried her head on Wickham's shoulder. Darcy quietly let himself out of the house and went directly to the stables. Sure enough, there in the carriage drive were the tracks of Thorpe's gig. This chase should be rather fun. 15. A Laughable Adventure. "Get along, you miserable bag of bones!" John Thorpe cracked his whip.
"You have been doing that for the past half-hour,"
said Elizabeth wearily.
"To what purpose? The poor animal cannot run any faster."
"What do you know about horses, you who cannot ride?"
"For one who styles himself as an intrepid horseman," she flung back, "I marvel that you have so little compassion."
Compassion won't get us to the next coaching stop.
And threatening your poor horse will."
He cast a glance over his shoulder.
"Are you expecting someone, Mr. Thorpe?"
added Elizabeth sweetly. He gave a grunt of displeasure, but said nothing more. Elizabeth decided not to taunt him further. Silence was preferable. She fell to studying the road beneath them. The horse maintained a steady gallop, causing the gig to sway. Could it be so very disastrous to jump? Would she be able to avoid the wheel? Elizabeth slid nearer to the edge. A rattling fall could hurt, but she was past caring. "Hey!" cried Mr. Thorpe. "We'll have none of that." He caught hold of Elizabeth's arm and jerked her back. However, his inattention to the reins caused the gig to swerve. Crack! A wheel hit a milestone half hidden in last summer's grass. The gig lurched, and John Thorpe gave a scream of frustration. Although Elizabeth had been clinging to the side rail, she felt herself lift from the seat. The road came rushing to meet her, and she landed on her side in the ditch. Meanwhile, her cousin continued to scream. Elizabeth climbed to her feet, brushing muddied snow and dirt from her cloak. The brim of her bonnet was crushed, but she was able to stand. That at least was a mercy.
"A fine thing," she cried. "It is a marvel that we weren't killed."
All John Thorpe could do was curse.
"My gig! My beautiful gig! Look there, the axle is broken."
He retrieved his hat from the ground and glowered at Elizabeth.
"This is your fault." "In what way? I know nothing about horses, and you do. You distracted me. As if you weren't looking over your shoulder every other minute. Whom were you expect—"
Elizabeth broke off speaking. A horseman was coming along the road, riding hard.
"Hey, where do you think you are going?"
"Home, Mr. Thorpe," said Elizabeth crisply.
"I am walking home."
"You'll never make it."
"Oh, but I think I shall."
The sound of the rider now caught his attention.
"Who the devil is that?"
"I believe it is Mr. Darcy. Can you not recognize his horse?" Thorpe fell to cursing.
"Where did he come from?"
"From Longbourn, presumably." Elizabeth straightened her bonnet and moved to meet him. No doubt she looked a fright, and her temper was in shreds. Yet she could not help but smile. Never had she loved him more. Darcy swung down from Challenger.
"Thank God!"
he cried.
"Are you hurt?"
"Of course she is not hurt," shouted Mr. Thorpe. "There is plenty of dirt. It made for excellent falling. But my gig, the finest in all England. Look at that wheel, look at that axle." He narrowed his eyes at Elizabeth. "You'll pay for this." "I think not." Darcy put his arm around Elizabeth's shoulder and drew her close. "Are you injured, my love? Be honest."
"My love?" cried Mr. Thorpe. "What's all this?"
"I am fine, Fitzwilliam, truly. No broken bones. In truth, I am too angry to be hurt." "We'll get you home." "I can walk. It is less than 10 miles, an easy distance." His lopsided smile appeared. "Are you feeling brave?" "At the moment, I have courage enough for anything." "Good. I'll take you up with me on Challenger. He is able to bear us both."
"But, Fitzwilliam—"
"Never fear. I shan't let you fall. We'll take it at an easy pace." He lowered his voice. "Do you trust me?"
"With all my heart, but—"
"Once you are up, hold tightly to Challenger's mane. You shall not hurt him." Mr. Thorpe, meanwhile, was continuing to breathe out threats. "Stubble it," said Darcy shortly. "See to your horse."
"I demand satisfaction."
"I believe that privilege is mine to request, not yours. Frankly, I haven't the time. Consider yourself fortunate." Darcy turned to Elizabeth. "Shall we?"
"I warn you,"
cried John Thorpe. "I am the very devil of a pugilist. I have studied with the great gentleman Jackson himself." "Have you indeed?" said Darcy mildly.
"Yes, in his rooms at 13 Bond Street."
"Odd that I have never chanced to see you there."
"Ha! As if a soft chap like you would ever cross his threshold."
Darcy studied John Thorpe for a long moment. "Right," he said. "That's it." He turned to Elizabeth. "Do you mind holding my coat and hat? This should not take long."
"What are you doing? Fitzwilliam, you must wear your coat. It is wretchedly cold." Again his wry smile appeared. "How else am I to get in a home blow?" "A what?" John Thorpe let out a scream. "You dare?" Darcy shrugged out of his coat. "Mind the packet in the chest pocket. It ought to remain dry. Now then, shall it be the jaw or the nose?" "You are asking me?" cried Elizabeth. "The nose, I think," he said thoughtfully. "It will heal poorly, and improve Thorpe's appearance as a pugilist." Elizabeth gave a gurgle of laughter. This was too horrible. Fitzwilliam could not be serious. Was he truly about to hit Mr. Thorpe? "You might wish to examine the scenery for the next minute or two," he added. John Thorpe's response was to hide behind his horse. "You dare?" he repeated, rather less convincingly. "Come along, Thorpe. I do not like to keep Miss Elizabeth waiting." There was no response. At length Darcy gave a great sigh, lowered his fists, and turned to retrieve his coat. "You were right," he said to Elizabeth. "This will accomplish nothing. Moreover, I would be sure to get blood on my shirt. My valet hates that." John Thorpe came out from behind his horse. "Confound it, you cannot leave me here. I'll freeze." "Cut your horse free and ride into Meryton." "Without a saddle? Never. I don't abuse my cattle in that way." "As you wish," said Mr. Darcy. "By the by, there is no point in returning to Longbourn. You will find your mother and sisters at the local inn." He turned to Elizabeth. "What is its name?" "The Red Lion. But why would they be there?" "Your mother, bless her, found Thorpe's letter. She demanded that they leave at once." "Mamma did what?" "It was a tour de force that I count myself privileged to witness. Now then, if you are ready, I'll lift you up. Sit to the side as you normally would." "I wish I were a better rider." "You will be. I'll teach you." Before Elizabeth knew what was happening, she found herself seated on Challenger's saddle. Fitzwilliam swung up behind. His arm came round her, holding her securely against his chest. "All set. Here we go." "Heavens!" She buried her fingers in Challenger's mane and held on for dear life. "We'll take it at an easy pace." At length, Elizabeth's heart began to beat more normally. John Thorpe's shouts had receded into the distance. "We cannot leave him out here," she said. "No matter what he has done, he does not deserve to freeze." "I'll send someone back for him. Once it stops snowing, I'll show you our license." "Our what?" "My packet from London came, courtesy of our solicitor," he said into her ear. "It contains a special license obtained from the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury. All that remains is for you to choose our destination." "But I am going home." "Not necessarily. Is it to be Longbourn or the parish church?" "You must be joking. We cannot be married today. Can we?" "It makes no difference to me, although I would prefer to be wed sooner rather than later. One way or another, my love, you will be spending Christmas with me as Mrs. Darcy." 16. Fair and Softly. It was no surprise that the residents of Longbourn were still in an uproar. Elizabeth's return added to the turmoil, causing many happy tears. Mrs. Bennet even hailed Darcy as a hero. "Mamma," said Elizabeth, "where is father? Mr. Darcy must see him at once. It is urgent." Mrs. Bennet waved this aside. "Now that Mr. Thorpe is gone, I dare say he is in his library. Apparently Mr. Bingley came to see him earlier. Not that I knew anything about it. We have such news. Our Jane is to be married." Darcy now noticed that Charles Bingley was sharing one of the sofas with Jane. "I am very glad that you are not plunged into disgrace, Lizzie," added Mrs. Bennet. "And now that you are safely returned to us, the scandal brought on by those Thorpes is gone. Good riddance, I say." "Do you mind?" cried Mr. Collins. He was sitting in his usual chair by the fire, alone. "You are more than welcome to that awful girl," Mrs. Bennet told him. "Gracious, how she can screech, just like a banshee."
Mr. Collins muttered something Darcy could not hear. "Say what you will," continued Mrs. Bennet. "Providence has spared you a miserable fate, Mr. Collins. Imagine having to listen to all that whenever she did not get her way." Darcy hid a smile. "I expect Charlotte Lucas will not take him back," Mrs. Bennet told Elizabeth, "so he must look elsewhere for a wife. Our Kitty," she added, raising her voice, "is just as pretty as that Thorpe girl, and very good-natured, and our Mary has a fine morality. What more can a clergyman want?" Mr. Collins gave a loud sniff. Mrs. Bennet now had a good look at Elizabeth. "Bless me, your cloak is dripping water all over the floor. Go up at once and change your gown." This was as good a time as any for Darcy to take his leave. "If you will excuse me, ma'am," he said, "I'll just find Mrs. Hile. She can direct me to Mr. Bennet's library." Mrs. Bennet gave him a sunny smile. "As to that, sir, Lizzie is able to show you." Darcy turned to Elizabeth. "I ought to call at the rectory about tomorrow. Have I time to do that before dinner?" "Dinner?" Mrs. Bennet cast her gaze to the ceiling. "It is sure to be a ramshackle affair, and not what we are accustomed to at all. However, since you and dear Mr. Bingley are dressed for riding, we shan't stand upon ceremony. Not after such a day as this. You'll find nothing amiss with the dinner itself, mind. I pride myself on the bounty of our table." Elizabeth was hurried upstairs by Jane. "Not one of my better frocks, dearest," Elizabeth told her. "Fitzwilliam has come in all his dirt, and I do not wish to make him feel awkward." "Who?" said Jane. Goodness, how was Elizabeth to share her news? Who would believe it? "Has Mr. Bingley truly spoken with father? Are you indeed engaged?" "Oh, Lizzie, I am so happy. It is as if I am living in a dream, and now you are restored to us. I was never so thankful." Jane hesitated. "Was John Thorpe cruel? Did he harm you in any way?" "I was a little bruised when the gig overturned, but nothing more. Mr. Thorpe is not the skilful coachman he claims to be." "Gig?" "Yes, can you imagine? He abducted me in his gig, of all things, while it was snowing. That was not the wisest choice. From beginning to end, it was stupidly done. Before I had a chance to escape, Fitzwilliam Darcy came riding to the rescue, like a hero in a storybook. He very nearly came to blows with John Thorpe." "Fitzwilliam Darcy?" echoed Jane. "I meant to tell you before this. To be honest, it is so incredible that I have struggled to believe it myself. I dare say father will announce our news at dinner." "News? What news?" Elizabeth took hold of her sister's hand. "Dearest, tomorrow I am to be married." "Married to whom?" said Jane blankly. "Surely not to Mr. Collins." Elizabeth gave a gurgle of laughter. "To Fitzwilliam Darcy." Jane's eyes widened in surprise. "I cannot believe it. Have you not always hated him?" "Not as much as you might think." "How can you consider such a thing, dear Lizzie? It is not because of mamma, is it?" "No, indeed. How I have misjudged him." "But you have always thought him insufferably proud." "He has no improper pride. I love him dearly, and all the more for wishing to strike John Thorpe. He would have done so were the man not such a miserable coward." Jane sat down on the bed. "You should not be marrying Mr. Darcy simply because he rescued you." "It all began at the assembly on Monday," said Elizabeth. "No, to own the truth, it began much longer ago than that. During our stay at Netherfield. Charles wondered whether that was the case. He claimed that Mr. Darcy was in love with you, but I would not believe him. And now I am to be married to his best friend. Oh, Jane, wish me joy, and help me out of this gown, for I must hurry down to the library, and rescue Fitzwilliam from father." Jane began to work at the buttons. "Father will be very surprised. Everyone will. I can only hope that he will not withhold consent. There is no fear of that. Mamma would never allow it. I dare say she would screech even louder than Isabella Thorpe." "Was she as awful as all that?" "Lizzie, she was worse.
You should have seen Mr. Collins's face. He treated Charlotte Lucas abominably, but in that moment I felt quite sorry for him. Isabella only wanted him because of Longbourn. Tomorrow he must return to Hunsford, no longer an engaged man. Unless Mamma can convince him to propose to poor Mary. Mary will not have him, said Jane, and rightly so. Our eyes were certainly opened to the weakness in his character. He must begin again with someone else. We can only hope that he has learned his lesson. It took some convincing, for Elizabeth's father could not believe that she cared for Fitzwilliam as deeply as she claimed. To his credit, he rose to the occasion. Later, after everyone was seated at the dinner table, he pushed back his chair and stood. "It is my happy task," he said slowly, "to announce not one engagement but two. As you are aware, our Jane has agreed to become Mr. Bingley's wife." He lifted his glass. "Your mother and sisters and I wish you joy, my dear." Mrs. Bennet's voice came from the other end of the table. "But I distinctly heard you say two, Mr. Bennet." "I did indeed. This afternoon I gave my blessing to Mr. Darcy to marry our Elizabeth. I quote the inestimable Virgil, 'Love conquers all.'" "Lizzie is to be married?" said Lydia. "Yes, and very soon," said Mr. Bennet. "Mr. Robinson has agreed to perform the ceremony tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "Mr. Darcy had the forethought to obtain a special license." "But the breakfast? How shall I host the wedding breakfast with so little notice? No, Mr. Bennet, it is quite impossible." "It shall be done," he replied. "If anyone can carry off such an event, it will be you, Mrs. Bennet." "But the cake! We need a cake." "Mamma, food and drink do not matter," said Elizabeth. She was seated beside Fitzwilliam, and they shared a smile. "Of course they do. Christmas pudding, Lizzie, cannot be considered a proper substitute for a wedding cake. Then, too, if we eat the puddings tomorrow, what shall we do for Christmas? And then there is your gown. You cannot be married to a gentleman of Mr. Darcy's stature in just any frock. What would the neighbours say?" "Mamma," said Elizabeth, laughing. "We shall need to leave for London at midday," Fitzwilliam told her. "Now that the snow has ceased falling, our plan is to spend Christmas with my sister in Derbyshire." "At your handsome estate," said Mrs. Bennet. "Gracious, what a pity that Mr. Bennet has been ill. It would be delightful to travel there with you and spend all of January together." Her smile widened. "And now that those Thorpes are no longer here, we certainly may. If only Mr. Bennet will relent. After all," she added, "he has had only the most trifling of colds." It was impressive to see how Fitzwilliam gently dissuaded Mrs. Bennet from such an undertaking. He also bore patiently with her jubilation over the distinction of Elizabeth's future life. Now why was Charles Bingley whispering so urgently to Jane? Afterward, he did not join them in the drawing-room. Jane did not seem to mind his absence, but neither did she answer any of Elizabeth's questions. 17. Cleared out. Late that night a warmer breeze blew in, scouring out all traces of snow. The next day a pale winter sun rose in an unclouded sky. It would be a perfect day for the wedding. For once Elizabeth did not meet Fitzwilliam Darcy under the oak. At her mother's insistence she put on her best ivory ball gown. "For there is our dignity as a family to consider," said Mrs. Bennet. "You cannot marry Mr. Darcy wearing just anything." "Even though I might freeze," teased Elizabeth. "You'll wear your winter cloak to church, of course." "It shall be rather odd to arrive at his London house in a ball gown, mamma." Mrs. Bennet struck her hands together. "That's right. He has a London house. How splendid! I dare say it is in Mayfair, a very fashionable location, Lizzie. Darcy House. Do you suppose it is called?" "I honestly have no idea." Elizabeth turned to Jane. "Was my note delivered to Charlotte? It is important that she is with me at church. No matter what people are saying, they need to see that we support her." "Well," said Mrs. Bennet. Elizabeth interrupted. Mamma, none of this was Charlotte's fault. Isabella's wicked ambition caused everything. And there was also Mr. Thorpe's infamy, added Jane. However, we shan't mind that, not today. As father says, all's well that ends well. Mr. Bennet was very fond of Shakespeare, an interest he shared with Fitzwilliam. Perhaps one day the two of them would become friends. Elizabeth descended to find Mr. Collins pacing about in the vestibule. His trunk waited there, a mute testimony to the fact that he would soon be leaving for Kent. "My dear cousin Elizabeth," he called up to her, "may I be the first to congratulate you on this auspicious day?" "Have you time to attend the wedding?" said Mrs. Bennet. "My younger daughters will be glad to see you there." "My dear madam, I have no desire to slight a gentleman of Mr. Darcy's standing, and yet I am obliged to appease my noble patroness. Mr. Darcy told me that Lady Catherine might not be pleased with his marriage. He advised me not to attend, lest I incur her wrath." "Not pleased with our Elizabeth?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "A fine thing." Mr. Collins looked uncomfortable. "Apparently there is a family understanding regarding Mr. Darcy and Lady Catherine's daughter." "Then you had best go at once," said Elizabeth firmly. "You should know that Charlotte Lucas shall stand with me as I take my vows. But you have treated my friend in an infamous manner." Mr. Collins pursed up his lips, but said no more. Jane held out Elizabeth's cloak. Lydia offered a charming bonnet. "There," she said, tying the ivory ribbons under Elizabeth's chin. "There is no prettier bride in all of England." Mr. Bennet came in. "Are you ready, Lizzie?" he said, taking up his hat. "The coach is here." "I am." Elizabeth drew on her gloves, took her father's arm, and moved with him toward the door. Mrs. Bennet swung her cloak over her shoulders. "Hile," she called, "we should return within the hour." She looked to Mr. Collins. "You must promise to write to Mr. Bennet, sir. The oftener the better. We are always glad to receive your letters, particularly Kitty and Mary, and Lydia too. Now, Lizzie," she went on, "is your trunk closed and corded? Is it ready to be carried down? I cannot fathom why Mr. Darcy did not have it fetched last night." Here was another thing. Fitzwilliam mentioned hiring a travelling coach for their journey today. Why not borrow Mr. Bingley's? All became clear when they arrived at Meryton's parish church. As Elizabeth's father handed her down, a mud-spattered coach rounded the corner and came to a halt. The 4 horses were steaming, as if they had travelled a distance. Who should open its door but Mr. Bingley himself? Before the driver could let down the steps, he jumped out. "We drove through the night, and here we are," he called cheerfully. "Thank God the weather was in our favour." He then assisted a smiling young woman to descend. "Here, as you see, is Miss Darcy, come in time for the wedding. And her companion, too. Won't Darcy be surprised?" Jane went directly to Charles Bingley and took hold of his arm. In her eyes he was clearly a hero. Mr. Bingley was mindful to introduce Georgiana to Elizabeth. "In a few minutes' time," he added, "she shall be your very own sister." The family went inside and gathered in the narthex. Charlotte Lucas waited there, clad in a drab cloak and bonnet, along with her mother. Elizabeth took hold of Charlotte's gloved hand. "Mr. Collins is gone," she whispered. "You needn't worry about encountering him." Charlotte's chin came up. "He is nothing to me, I assure you. On Monday, my brother and I depart for Wiltshire to visit my father's sister. We should arrive on Christmas Eve. The same day I arrive at Pemberley," said Elizabeth. Pemberley, Fitzwilliam's grand estate, would now be her home. A ghost of a smile appeared on Charlotte's face. "Did I not once say that Mr. Darcy was in love with you? How delightful to be proven right! I wish you joy, dearest Eliza, with all my heart." She paused. "I could be in Wiltshire for quite some time. Promise to write. God only knows when we shall meet again." Mr. Robinson came forward. "All is in readiness. Shall we join Mr. Darcy at the altar? Mr. Bennet, if you and Miss Elizabeth will just follow me." Elizabeth's family surged forward into the sanctuary, and her father offered his arm. As she laid her hand upon it, she stole a glance at him. What Charlotte said was very true. God only knew when Elizabeth would see him, or any of them, again. She ought to feel a pang of regret, but there was no room for sorrow in her heart today. At the front of the church waited Fitzwilliam, looking particularly handsome. As Elizabeth advanced down the aisle, the smile in his eyes made its way to his lips. Indeed, everyone was smiling as they joined hands and together recited their vows. If there was fault to be found with the wedding breakfast, Mrs. Bennet was the only one to notice. This was as happy a gathering as any Longbourn had seen.
"We ought to have dancing," Lydia told Elizabeth, "and so we should, if there were enough gentlemen."
Presently the drawing-room door came open to admit Hile. She went directly to Mr. Bennet. "Have they indeed?" Elizabeth heard her father say. "By all means, admit them." To Elizabeth's surprise, in came Colonel Forster, Captain Carter, and Sir Hugh the squire. Sir Hugh made his bow to Mr. Bennet. "We are sorry to intrude on such a fine occasion. A wedding, is it? Best wishes to the bride and groom." Colonel Forster spoke up. "We'll come straight to the point, sir, so as not to take up your time. Have any of you chanced to see George Wickham? He has gone missing." Mrs. Bennet came rustling forward.
"Bless me, has he been abducted? We have had our share of that lately."
"His gear is gone, ma'am," said Captain Carter. "It appears that he is cleared out, as the saying goes."
"What a shame! Did life in the militia not agree with him? He was very fine in his regimentals."
"It was the size of his debts that did not agree with him, ma'am," said Sir Hugh dryly. "We have not seen him," said Mr. Bennet. "Perhaps Mrs. Thorpe and her daughters will know more. I believe they are staying at the Red Lion." "That's just the trouble, sir. A bit of an uproar there," said Colonel Forster. "The son is with them, but the eldest daughter has disappeared. The letter she left for her mother indicates that she did not go alone, if you take my meaning." Mr. Bennet's brows went up. "Indicative," he said. "The Thorpes intend to travel to London as soon as may be," said Sir Hugh. "Whether Mr. Thorpe will find his sister there in the company of Wickham is anyone's guess." Once the gentlemen departed, Elizabeth's youngest sisters lamented the loss of their favourite.
"To think that dear, dear Wickham is now married," said Kitty, "to horrid Isabella of all people."
"Let us hope that is the case," said Elizabeth mildly.
"Of course he will marry her," cried Lydia. "You may have forgotten her shares in that gold mine in Jamaica, but I have not. Lucky girl! I might have married him myself, if only I had an independence."
"And a dilapidated house beneath a bridge," whispered Elizabeth to her husband. "Lucky Wickham," he whispered back. 18. What Love Is. Georgiana Darcy was a delight, and her companion was a very pleasant woman. The journey to London was a matter of some 30 miles, an easy distance according to Fitzwilliam. Every comfort had been provided. He himself tucked the lap robe around Elizabeth. Smiling, she slid closer and spread it over the both of them. "It is warmer to share." "I concur," he murmured. She rested her head against his shoulder. How wonderful it was to have an understanding husband. Later that night, in Darcy's comfortable London library, over after-dinner coffee, Elizabeth described to Georgiana John Thorpe's abduction, and her brother's daring rescue. "It was not all that heroic," he protested, smiling.
"But it was." Elizabeth turned to Georgiana. "Never did I imagine that John Thorpe meant to elope, with me of all people. But I suppose it is the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. He assumed that I had a fortune, you see. That was his sole motivation."
Elizabeth was rewarded by the shine in her new sister's eyes.
"Yes,"
said Georgiana softly.
"He cared nothing for me," Elizabeth went on, "and by the end of the day I suspect he was relieved that I was gone. I scolded him shamefully." "You didn't!"
cried Georgiana, delighted. "Now that I am safely wed, I am able to confess the whole. Your brother ought to be on his guard. Shakespeare's Katharina was my inspiration, and you know how she can rip and tear." Fitzwilliam laughed softly. "I am not afraid of you." He raised his coffee cup in mock salute. "I am ignoble enough to wish that he had broken Mr. Thorpe's nose. There, now you know the depth of my iniquitous nature." "I can only hope," said Georgiana softly, "that when I have my first London season, you shall be at my side."
"My uncle's wife is to sponsor her," Fitzwilliam put in quickly. "You needn't take that on."
"But you shall be my guard, dearest Elizabeth," said Georgiana. "If any improper gentleman dares to abuse me, you shall soundly scold him into submission."
Presently Georgiana's weariness caught up with her.
"I should go up now," she said, after smothering yet another yawn. "Mr. Bingley arrived in the wee hours of the morning. Because of the weather, we had to be gone within the hour."
"It was wonderful to have you with us today," said Fitzwilliam. "I shall always be indebted to Bingley for his thoughtful sacrifice." At the foot of the stairs he gave Georgiana her candle. He and Elizabeth remained together, arm in arm, watching her go. The remainder of the house was dark. "Little more than a week ago, I used to dream of you," he whispered. "Or, rather, I attempted not to dream of you, for I considered my plight to be hopeless. And now here you are, as my very own." What else could Elizabeth do but kiss him? The journey to Derbyshire was spread over 2 days. For the most part it was uneventful. As Pemberley Woods came into view and they turned in at the lodge, a light snow began to fall. Elizabeth's heart was hammering. She must check her curiosity. She must not stare in an ill-bred way.
"Tell me again about your Christmas traditions," she said to Georgiana. "I am eager to take up your mother's former duties."
Georgiana was very willing to answer every question.
"My sister Jane and I take gifts to Longbourn's tenants, and also to those who are ill. Shall you and I do the same?"
"That is my earnest hope," said Fitzwilliam. "Bless you for your kindness." The park was very large, and they drove for some time through a beautiful wood, stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind became too full for conversation. Was she truly mistress of all this? They gradually ascended for half a mile. Here the wood ceased, and Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley, came into view. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high, woody hills. Elizabeth gazed out the window glass in wonder. What an incredible vista! The dusting of snow only added to its beauty.
"I have never seen a place for which nature has done more," she said quietly. "The house is beautiful, and enormous. I dare say it shall take weeks for me to learn my way."
"When I was a boy, before my mother became ill, she was known for hosting splendid house parties," said Fitzwilliam. "One day, perhaps you and I shall do the same."
"We'll invite my entire family," Elizabeth teased. "Every obnoxious relation, and they shall fill every bedchamber." "Some of the rooms have fallen into disuse," said Georgiana.
"But not many," added Fitzwilliam.
"Have you a gallery with portraits? I should like to meet your ancestors." "My brother has lately had a new one made. It is very good."
He made a disparaging sound.
"I'll leave it for you, dear Elizabeth, to decide if it is very like. He insists that I sit for one at the time of my come-out."
"It is therefore your task," Fitzwilliam told her, "to become even more beautiful than you are now." Georgiana's only response was to laugh. The rooms of the house were lofty and well-proportioned, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. This elegant mansion was now Elizabeth's home. In the dining parlour, over the mantelpiece, she noticed several miniatures suspended. She crossed the room to examine them. One was of Fitzwilliam, looking grave and handsome. Elizabeth touched the frame of it, smiling. But one of the others was of George Wickham.
She looked quickly to her husband. "Why is this here?" she whispered.
"I keep it in memory of my father." He lowered his voice. "Wickham was his godson, and quite a favourite." Elizabeth drew a long breath. An old proverb came to mind. "Begin as you mean to continue." Here was a perfect opportunity. "Do you not think," she said gently, "that it is time to put the past behind us? I shan't make many changes to Pemberley, but I have no desire to see this man's face. I dare say neither do you and Georgiana." Elizabeth then turned Mr. Wickham's miniature to face the wall. Fitzwilliam's arm came around Elizabeth's waist, and he drew her close. "Well done, my love. A new day for Pemberley indeed. I'd gladly return the favour, but we have no likeness of John Thorpe." "As if anyone would," said Elizabeth merrily. "Other than his mother, that is. And now, what do you say to a nice cup of tea?" "And a kiss beneath the mistletoe." Elizabeth widened her eyes at him. "Have we mistletoe here?" "Certainly we do. My orders regarding that were explicit. Thorpe," he said, smiling, "is not the only one to possess shrewd ideas." This has been Step Lively, Mr. Darcy, a light-hearted Darcy and Elizabeth Christmastime romance. Written by Laura Hile. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Copyright 2022 by Laura Hile. Production copyright 2022 by Laura Hile.